For years, Beatrice Ingram had struggled to find her place in the world.
She was someone that, put it mildly, made some poor choices.
But then she married a cab driver named Terry Camper.
Beatrice loved Terry. He was good to her.
They enjoyed each other's company. They were together all the time.
They spent 10 happy years together. But in 2012, their marriage would suddenly, tragically end.
There's a dead man on the street.
I opened the car door to check for vital signs. My hand was full of blood.
He had been shot twice in the back of the head.
The beloved cab driver's murder came as a shock to the entire community.
Why would you want to shoot him? Why would anybody do that?
Was it a robbery?
Someone who has a substance abuse problem. They're just trying to, score some cash real quick.
Or did Beatrice have a dark secret in her past?
Detectives recovered a box that contained hundreds of letters.
Would the letters lead police to the killer?
John Murray was a convicted murderer. He was adamant that he was being railroaded.
Or was that all part of Beatrice's plan?
His mother says, "That bitch killed my son."
Peekskill, New York, October 3rd, 2012. Nestled on the banks of the Hudson River, this picturesque town of 25,000 is conveniently close to Manhattan.
It's about a 45-minute commute from New York City. More of a suburban type area. A lot of families there. A lot of people commute back forth to the city.
But Peekskill retains all its quaint, small-town charm.
It's one of those kinds of towns where you may not know everybody by name, but you certainly know everybody by face.
Which is why the 911 call that came in just after 2 that afternoon from a mail carrier on Pine Street was such an incredible shock.
Peekskill 911 emergency. There's a dead man on the street. On Pine Street? Yeah, he's in his car. He looks like he probably had a heart attack.
Police and EMTs rushed to Pine Street, and Officer Liz Fulch was the first to arrive.
I approached the vehicle, and I realized that there was the taxi driver that I knew as Terry, slumped over to the right side.
53-year-old Terry Camper had been driving a cab in Peekskill for almost 30 years.
Terry was well known in the community, very popular, just one of those guys that always had a smile on his face.
The guy that will wave at you every morning, that you will see at the local deli, that you will grab a cup of coffee, say hello, how's the family?
But was the friendly, easygoing cab driver actually dead? Despite what the 911 call reported, Officer Fulch hoped that wasn't the case.
I called, sir, are you okay? And he didn't respond.
And when Officer Fulch opened the door of the cab to check Terry's vital signs, she found out why he wasn't responding. And contrary to what the 911 call said, it wasn't a heart attack.
I touched blood on the left side of his neck. My hand was full of blood. That's when I realized that it was something more.
He had been shot twice in the back of the head.
And yet, despite the grave nature of Terry's injuries, the original report of a dead man on the street was incorrect.
EMS arrived on the scene shortly after I did. With their equipment, they were able to detect some signs of life.
And with Terry clinging desperately to life, the EMTs fought to save him.
They just removed him out of the vehicle and started performing CPR, attempting to resuscitate him. It was pretty intense.
And within minutes, they'd hustled Terry into the back of the ambulance and raced off to the emergency room.
I was just like, oh my God, he has a family, he has a wife. I really hope that this guy makes it through.
With Terry's fate still uncertain as the ambulance raced away, the police made an urgent call to his wife, 60-year-old Beatrice Camper, to break the horrifying news that her husband of 10 years was fighting for his life. Born in 1952, Beatrice Ingram started life an hour downriver from Peekskill.
She lived in Queens when she was younger.
And it was there that teenage Beatrice fell for a neighborhood boy named John.
They, developed a friendship.
Eventually, John and Beatrice became an item.
Beatrice very much was in love with John.
But Beatrice had fallen for a bad boy.
He had gotten in a lot of trouble. He'd been involved in drugs.
And her teenage romance soon led her down a dangerous path.
She started out with pills, and from pills, she went to the hard stuff, which was cocaine.
She was someone that, put it mildly, made some poor choices.
John's choices soon landed him behind bars, though. Heartbroken by her boyfriend's incarceration, Beatrice did her best to start over. And by her 20s, she'd met someone new and appeared to be on a better path.
She was married. She got 2 girls and a boy.
But that relationship eventually ended. And once her kids were grown, Beatrice struggled with what to do for the next chapter of her life. A search that would lead her to Peekskill, New York, and Terry Camper. 7 years younger than Beatrice, Terry's life also started south of Peekskill, 1,200 miles south.
We all are from Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
But when Terry was only 5, the family moved north after their father took a job near Peekskill.
Daddy worked at the Veterans Hospital, which is in Montrose, New York, until he was 79, and then he retired.
And as a result, Peekskill was the only home that Terry ever really knew.
He really wouldn't have remembered anything about Mississippi. He was 5 years old.
Growing up in Peekskill, Terry thrived in his new environment.
He always had a lot of friends. Even at a young age, he'd have friends coming around to the house, and he'd be there all the time.
Terry was easygoing, lovable, playful, and outgoing.
And not long after graduating high school in 1978, he launched a career that fit with his easygoing, gregarious nature.
He started his own taxi company. That's all he wanted to do. It was nothing else he wanted to do but drive the taxi.
It meant everything to him. He loved to be out in the public.
And by the end of the 90s, Terry had built a successful business.
Lawyers, doctors, everybody wanted him to take him to the airport or wherever.
The lovable cabbie had also become a fixture in his hometown.
He's a guy that the community knew. Nice guy. He'd always wave hello if you saw you, driving around Peekskill. He'd always throw you a wave.
Terry talked to everybody, the police, the mayor, you name it, anybody. He never met a stranger.
However, at the age of 40, Terry had yet to meet someone special.
He always called himself a lady man, but I just never known him to be like that, just from lady to lady to lady.
Ladies' man or not, Terry was about to become seriously involved.
He met Beatrice at the train station. He picked her up, taking her back home to, which is White Plains.
And as the friendly cab driver talked to her, he learned that Beatrice was trying to turn her life around after a long struggle with drug addiction.
She'd been through detox, and she was in the Y because she needed somewhere in the state. She didn't have nowhere to stay, and she has to go through that program.
After that meeting, then he got her number or where she lived, and he would pick her up from time to time, and then he brought her up to meet the family.
And it was clear that Beatrice was becoming more than just a regular fare.
He talked to me. He said, I like her. I like her a lot.
And when Beatrice completed her program, Terry convinced his family to help.
When she came out the Y, she had nowhere to go. My mother took her in. She stayed with my mother a good 8-9 months.
So they got closer and closer, and they just started dating.
Beatrice's recovery had given her a new lease on life, and Terry was clearly a big part of that.
They really liked each other. I was like, okay, this'll work. They enjoyed each other's company.
The couple eventually got an apartment together, and after a year of dating, Terry asked Beatrice to marry him.
Terry loved her dearly. He did a lot for her and her family.
Beatrice said yes. After all, he had rescued her when she needed it most.
Beatrice loved Terry because he was good to her.
And in 2002, they were married.
It was a beautiful wedding. Yeah, because my brother and I and the rest of us, we did all the cooking for the wedding.
And marrying Beatrice made Terry an instant grandparent, since her children were grown with children of their own.
Her grandkids, every one of them loved him. Every one of them, because her daughter kids was in the car with him all the time. He'd bring them over to my house.
He loved them little kids like they were his own.
And over the next few years, the couple settled into a modest but comfortable life together.
She was working at Walmart. He was really doing good at that point. He had other people running for him, so his money was coming in, and he was able to take care of his taxi business.
Terry still loved to drive, though. He drove his cab regularly, and Beatrice was often at his side.
Beatrice used to ride with Terry everywhere on his runs.
Except when she was away visiting her daughter for the weekend or at work.
He'd take her to work. And then after they get off from work, they ride around. They were together all the time.
However, Beatrice wouldn't be along for what turned out to be Terry's last ride. Coming up, was Terry's final passenger a killer?
Man says, I need a ride from Pine Street.
And if so, where was he now?
We were able to track that phone.
It was a little after 2 on the afternoon of October 3rd, 2012, when the police in picturesque Peekskill, New York, received a surprising 911 call.
There's a dead man on the street. On Pine Street? Yeah, he's in his car.
And when officers arrived on Pine Street a few minutes later, they were shocked to find 53-year-old Terry Camper slumped behind the wheel of his taxi cab. The beloved cabbie had been shot twice in the back of the head.
I knew Mr. Camper as a local taxi driver. I traveled with Mr. Camper into the ambulance, into the hospital. The EMS guys were working very hard. Immediately upon his arrival to the hospital, they continued life-saving measures. They continued to perform CPR.
And while the doctors did everything they could, Terry's wife of 10 years, 60-year-old Beatrice Camper, rushed to his side.
His wife has shown up within what appeared to me minutes of our arrival at the hospital.
Unfortunately, Beatrice was already too late.
At 3:05, they pronounced him dead. She was crying. She was visibly upset.
I met B in the hallway, and B hugged me. He's gone. And I said, okay, he's gone. I said, what happened?
But Beatrice said she didn't know, because while the doctors told her and the family that Terry was dead, it was the police who told them how Terry died.
He told her he had been shot in the back of the head. They don't know who did it, but he had been shot in the back of the head twice.
He was saying, shot. Why would someone want to shoot him?
It was just too shocking. He didn't bother nobody. He didn't do anything to anyone.
The most logical assumption, based on what police knew so far, was a robbery.
I always tell him, I says, Lizard, stop showing your money, because he would always tell me like he was showing a few dollars. I said, put your money away.
When you have a taxi driver known to carry cash, it would be the direction any investigator would probably begin to go in.
So hoping to piece together Terry's last hours, the investigators turned to the friends and family gathered in the waiting room.
The family at the hospital was understandably very distraught, upset, emotional, but at the same time, they were very helpful. We needed to find out who he was last with. That's going to give us the information that we need.
And it just so happened that one of Terry's friends had an important clue to share. A friend of Terry's named Ruth, she often rode along with him for company.
He always liked somebody else to be there. So Ruth would ride because she didn't have a job at the time.
Ruth told the investigators that she'd been riding with Terry earlier that afternoon. And shortly before he dropped her off, Terry had gotten a call.
She said she picked up the phone. Ruth would answer the phone all the time in the car. And the man says, I need a ride from Pine Street.
Did the fact that the caller wanted to be picked up on the street where Terry had been shot mean he was the killer? Back at the crime scene, there was nothing inside the cab to identify Terry's final fare, though police did find some key evidence.
There were 2 shell casings in the car and a live round left in the backseat of the car.
We were looking for a 22 caliber handgun as the murder weapon.
And in addition to the shell casings in the back seat, the investigators at the scene also found Terry's empty wallet.
A crime with someone who has a substance abuse problem, something along those lines where they're not thinking correctly and they're just trying to, score some cash real quick. That was our first impression of what might have happened.
And if the killer was an addict looking for some quick cash, it looked like they'd made a critical error.
Terry's cell phone was not in the cab, and that was not on his person.
Had the killer taken it? The investigators hoped that was the case.
Smartphones put off a GPS locator, and you can ping it and find out where it is.
And contacted the phone carrier. We were able to track that phone.
We found that the cell phone was not in Peekskill.
It was across the Hudson near West Point.
We had a general area of where the phone was.
It was somewhere along a wooded stretch of highway not far from the river.
At that point, we just had a detective constantly calling the phone, and we basically just walked through the woods and the side of the road until actually detective did actually hear the phone ringing.
It was located on the side of a road, as if it had been thrown out of a window of a moving car.
The cell phone trace hadn't led the police directly to Terry's killer, but it did provide a crucial clue.
Once we find the cell phone, we know that somebody took it from him and that they fled north, that they went at least from Peekskill up into Orange County, at least as far as the cell phone went. And in order for someone to do that, they would have to cross the Bear Mountain Bridge, just based on where the telephone was located. And that was important because we knew that the Bear Mountain Bridge had video surveillance cameras on it and recorded every vehicle that went over it.
The question was, whose car were they looking for? Could the call log of Terry's phone provide an answer?
Police immediately tried to figure out who the last phone call was made from. And what happened is they were able to trace that call to a burner phone.
But since it was a prepaid or burner phone, it appeared that investigators had reached a dead end.
That's basically a phone you buy, and you put minutes on it. There wasn't a name associated that we could track down.
Desperate, the investigators contacted the burner phone's provider. And while they had no way to identify who had purchased the phone, they could provide police with a list of calls made by the burner. And when the detectives reviewed it, they realized that in addition to Terry, the owner of the burner phone had also called a woman named Sandra Dolman.
They rang my bell. The Peekskill police, state police, and a state trooper. So I asked them, what was the problem? Did I get any calls or did I make any calls?
They showed her the number, which she immediately identified as being her friend, John Murray.
And then when I was down at the police station, they asked me, how did I know Mr. Murray? I told them that I met John Murray through an associate of mine who was a resident of Sing Sing.
In other words, an inmate of New York's maximum security state prison.
John Murray, we found after running a criminal history on him to be someone who had recently served time for 2 murders.
He had gotten out in November of 2011. He was still on parole.
And for the past 11 months, he'd been living with his wife.
She was a minister. She came to visit him on a ministry, and she married him in prison.
However, what stood out to the investigators was the fact that John and his wife lived in the town of Newburgh, across the Hudson from Peekskill.
Obviously, to go back to Newburgh, you can take that same route of travel over the bridge.
And when the investigators reviewed the surveillance footage from the bridge, it looked as if everything was finally falling into place.
We were able to observe the vehicle, which we believe to be John Murray's. They crossed the Bear Mountain Bridge at approximately 1 p.m., heading east toward Peekskill. And then we had that same vehicle coming back across the bridge toward Newburgh at approximately 2 p.m.
It's hard not to say that there was a connection there when you see John Murray's vehicle essentially cross over the bridge right when the murder takes place and then leave the bridge shortly after the murder takes place.
But what was the connection between John and Terry? Why would he want the cab driver dead?
I mean, he was the kind of guy you wouldn't think had an enemy in the world.
Less than 10 hours after the shooting, the Peekskill police were in Newburgh looking for some answers.
A little after midnight, we knocked on the door of Mr. Murray's residence. They wasn't happy to see us.
Although the ex-con did cooperate.
John agrees to go to City Newburgh Police Department. At that point, he's interviewed by 2 of our detectives.
Though as soon as John sat down with the detectives, they realized the ex-con would be tough to crack.
He had a 1,000-yard stare when you talked to him. He looked right through you. He gave off this aura of just someone who was very cold and dark.
They asked where he was that day. He stated he was, in the city of Newburgh. He was with his wife. Basically gives nothing that he was in Peekskill.
The investigators knew it was a lie.
They had very clear footage of the car, of its license plate, of a person who fits the description of John Murray.
But then they started to press John, asking questions about his cell phone number.
At that point, he stops talking with the detective. He just stopped answering any other questions, and he wanted to leave.
It certainly looked suspicious, especially when coupled with the evidence that the police already had. They knew that John Murray was a convicted killer, They knew he'd placed a call to Terry shortly before the murder, and they could put him traveling to and from the scene of the crime.
You're starting to really get pieces coming together, and you're starting to realize that you have a very strong suspect.
However, despite all the circumstantial evidence pointing to John, the police still couldn't quite prove that he had killed Terry.
So at that point, he was free to go.
Because while they suspected he had killed the cabbie, the investigators still had no idea why John would want Terry dead. Coming up, the investigators uncover some surprising evidence.
There was hundreds of phone calls, hundreds.
And the phone calls lead to a new suspect.
He was sending her love letters almost daily.
By the morning of October 4th, 2012, it had been less than 25 hours since Beatrice Camper's husband, Terry, had been murdered while driving his cab in Peekskill, New York. But the investigators already had a suspect, John Murray.
We've pretty much put him in the area of the crime. We've put him along the path where the cell phone was recovered. We've got something going on here.
And most suspicious of all, John had recently been released from prison.
Red flags went up when they realized that John Murray was a convicted murderer.
However, despite all the clues pointing to John as the killer, one big question remained.
What's the relationship with Terry Camper and John Murray? They seem like two guys on two different sides of the tracks.
Why would you want to shoot him? It just could not register in my mind. Why? Why would anybody do that?
So, hoping to uncover just how the two men were connected, the investigators contacted the New York State prison system.
They combed through countless records that they keep, whether they be visitor logs or telephone logs, and during their investigation, and discovered telephone conversations between Murray and Camper, Mrs. Camper.
60-year-old Beatrice Camper was Terry's wife of more than 10 years, but the phone records revealed that she'd known John Murray at least as long.
There was a large amount of phone activity between John Murray and Beatrice while he was incarcerated.
There was hundreds of phone calls, hundreds.
More than 900 alone in the last 11 months of John's sentence.
That's 2 to 3 calls per day that John and Beatrice were making to each other.
And it wasn't just phone calls either.
Go through back records of visitors that had come to see John Murray while he was incarcerated, and there was numerous visits from Beatrice.
And since Terry's wife was the connection to John Murray, the next question the investigators needed to answer was just how did Beatrice know the ex-con?
There was definitely a relationship there, and it was a long relationship.
It was John Murray's friend Sandra Dolman, the woman who'd put the investigators onto him in the first place, who revealed just how long Beatrice had known him.
They known each other in Queens years before this happened.
They'd started out as neighbors, but had quickly become much more.
John is a very charismatic guy. He's a handsome guy. He's a funny guy.
And he had been Beatrice's first love.
John and Beatrice had a relationship, a physical relationship. There were a lot of drugs involved, and they were kind of on the street a little bit, but they were very much in love.
But in 1977, the couple's intense and tumultuous love affair had come to an abrupt end.
He was ultimately convicted in Queens on 2 homicides, and he did about 30 years in jail for those.
And while John was in jail, Beatrice had lost touch.
She moved. She had this whole other life.
A full life with children and grandchildren, culminating in her decade-long marriage to Terry Camper. But in 2002, shortly after she met Terry, John was suddenly back in Beatrice's life.
While John was incarcerated, Beatrice had gone to this fair where they allow, inmates and visitors to sort of interact. And Beatrice was invited by a friend of hers who was visiting her own family member, and Beatrice accompanied her to this fair where she happened to run into John Murray. And then they started, writing letters back and forth to each other.
And based on the prison logs, the letters, phone calls, and visits had continued and intensified for the next 10 years, despite the fact that Beatrice was married to Terry.
John and Beatrice, at one point, were talking, pretty much daily.
But what did that relationship have to do with Terry's murder? His family believed they knew. They told the investigators that at the beginning of the marriage, Terry and Beatrice had gotten along well.
He seemed very happy. And I thought she was happy too.
But in the last few years of their decade-long marriage, the family had noticed a change.
I think she was falling out of love with Terry.
Not only did Terry's cousin think that Beatrice was falling out of love, she thought that Beatrice might be seeing someone else.
It's just a change in her. She would fix up different. Her hair, her clothing was different. And always going somewhere on the weekend.
According to Beatrice, she was visiting her daughter, who lived in Yonkers. But Terry's cousin wasn't so sure.
I think she had someone else on the side.
And according to his sister, Terry was growing suspicious too.
He came up to me, he says, there's something not right with her, with B.
But the family said that Terry was determined to stick things out.
He loved her. He wanted to make his marriage work.
And that became increasingly difficult as time went on, according to the family.
She would be a little mean to him. She would talk down to him.
She got to the point where every time he'd say something, she yelled and screamed. I'm like, why is that?
Well, I said, why do you keep taking it? He said, well, that's my wife, and I want my marriage to work. I said, but you don't have to take abuse like that. I said, not to make a marriage work. I said, both of you have to want it. Apparently, she doesn't want it. Well, he said, well, please don't talk about my wife.
Terry's sister said that barely a week before her brother's death, she'd urged him to leave Beatrice.
He says, neither one of us is happy. I said, wasn't you time to get out of that? I said, because nothing comes good out of a relationship when both of you are not happy.
But she said that he'd refused.
He said, I can't leave because she has nowhere to go. I said, move in with me and my mother. He's like, I just can't move out the apartment.
Had that decision cost Terry his life? His family was convinced.
His mother, Susie, says, that bitch killed my son.
Based on what they'd learned about her marriage and her connection to John Murray, the investigators brought Beatrice in for questioning on the afternoon of October 4th.
Detectives asked her if she had known a John Murray.
First, she denied knowing him. And when we knew that that was false.
And as far as the investigators were concerned, the fact that she'd lied about knowing John was just as telling.
We're onto something here.
And not just in the interrogation room. Because when the investigators brought Beatrice in for questioning, they also executed a search warrant for the apartment she shared with Terry.
During the execution of the search warrant in Miss Camper's apartment, detectives recovered a box that contained hundreds of letters of correspondence between Beatrice and John.
Love letters that she had kept when John Murray was in prison, sending her love letters almost daily.
Me and my partner kind of looked at each other and we're like, wow, she's really, she's involved in this.
The plot thickened, so to speak.
Once we began to see what was written in them, we realized now we had motive.
The investigators searching the apartment immediately passed on what they'd found to their counterparts in the interrogation room, who turned up the heat on Beatrice.
They started to bring out, the proof that they had, that Beatrice had made phone calls to John Murray, and John Murray had made phone calls to Beatrice.
And once she realized just how much the police already knew, Beatrice's story began to change.
Beatrice started to tell us what had happened.
She started out by admitting that she did know John Murray.
She told us that she was actually involved in an affair with him.
She would leave saying she was going to visit her daughter when she wasn't. She was going to meet John Murray.
And according to Beatrice, during those meetups, eventually they began talking about ways to get Terry out of the picture.
She decided that, she needed to come clean, and she gave us the information that she had conspired with Mr. Murray to kill her husband.
She did admit that, her and John had been planning this for quite a while, and that, she was involved in the, in the murder of her husband.
Although according to Beatrice, it was John's idea, one that she'd gotten swept up in, foolishly obsessed with the prospect of being reunited with her first love.
I think the guilt was weighing on her. She couldn't handle it anymore. A weight was lifted off of her. She definitely seemed very remorseful. I'm sure there had to be some kind of satisfaction as to, holding all that guilt inside, obviously coming out and telling the truth at this point.
But would Beatrice's confession do her any good? Despite her cooperation, the Peekskill police placed her under arrest for Terry's murder.
She provided all the information that Murray needed to pull this off.
And thanks to Beatrice's confession, the investigators also felt they had enough to charge John Murray with murder.
He was taken into custody up in Newburgh.
When John Murray was arrested, he basically had no reaction. Didn't even ask why.
After all, John was a convicted killer. But in the weeks ahead, some people would be wondering, was he also a pawn? Coming up, will Beatrice's confession be enough to convict John?
There was no hard evidence against John Murray whatsoever.
Or will John turn on Beatrice?
He had given that phone to Beatrice Camper.
By April 9th, 2014, it had been a year and a half since Beatrice Camper's husband, Terry, had been murdered while driving his taxicab in Peekskill, New York.
Everyone had nothing but good things to say about Terry. Terry was a very well-known local cab driver.
Beatrice and a 62-year-old ex-con named John Murray had both been charged with the murder.
That was her boyfriend. They had corresponded while he was in prison.
In fact, at the time of her arrest in October of 2012, Beatrice had confessed to her role in the crime.
The guilt and the weight of this crime was definitely weighing on her. You could see it in her.
And it obviously still weighed on the 62-year-old grandmother when she walked into a Westchester County, New York courtroom that morning.
She had aged terrible. She didn't look like the same person that I had seen before. This process had taken a lot from her.
However, while she had been charged with second-degree murder for her role in the crime, she hadn't come to court to stand trial. Instead, she was there to testify against her old flame, John Murray, who was on trial for his alleged role in Terry's murder.
John was just adamant that he did not commit this crime and that he was being charged based on the fact that he had a bad prior record, and he was adamant that he was being railroaded.
But did Beatrice's old boyfriend have a point? After all, while they had considerable circumstantial evidence against him, the only thing directly connecting him to Terry's murder was Beatrice's confession. And the prosecutors had done everything in their power to secure her testimony against John.
The Westchester District Attorney's Office offered her a plea deal in exchange for her testimony against John.
That's a decision that was made to get the actual shooter, the trigger man. He definitely needed to be in jail for life, so that was the goal.
And it was no surprise that Beatrice had accepted the DA's offer.
I think Beatrice's primary motive was to lessen her responsibility in this case by pointing the finger at John Murray.
But could she close the deal for the prosecutors? When Beatrice took the stand, the entire case was riding on her testimony.
There was no firearm recovered. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual crime. There was no DNA evidence or any other forensic evidence.
There was no hard evidence against John Murray whatsoever. The only thing linking John Murray to this crime really is the testimony of Beatrice Camper.
On the stand, Beatrice began by explaining the background, how throughout her marriage to Terry, she and John had been having a secret affair.
She had romantic involvement with Mr. Murray, despite the fact that they were separated by prison bars.
And if the letters he'd sent her from prison were any indication, their romance had been pretty steamy, too.
She saved all of the letters, every single one of them, I believe, was recovered from her apartment. In the letters, it was a very sexually explicit relationship.
And if the hundreds of letters John had sent her weren't enough to prove just how devoted he was to Beatrice, the prosecutors also played tapes of the prison phone calls between the lovers.
There were a number of calls that the DA's office played. Some of them highlighted a lot of erotic talk and discussions of having sex.
And Beatrice said that once John was released from prison, the lovers had turned years of talk into reality, despite the fact that they were both married.
When John was released, he and Beatrice basically immediately met up.
And according to Beatrice, the affair continued for the next 11 months.
She was visiting him. They would get together.
However, Beatrice claimed that the affair wasn't the only motive behind Terry's murder.
They was in the plot to kill him for life insurance money.
At the time of his death, Terry had 2 insurance policies, totaling $100,000.
Their goal was to get rid of Mr. Camper and collect on that life insurance policy.
And one of those policies had been taken out barely a year before Terry's murder.
Shortly before your spouse dies, changing an insurance policy does not look good for the living spouse.
However, according to Beatrice, John was the one who pushed her to up the coverage, and the prosecutors had the audio tape to prove it.
They had quite a few discussions about that policy, discussions that were recorded on tape when Mr. Murray was in prison.
There is a conversation that takes place in which John tells Beatrice, in so many words, you need to up his, meaning Terry's, insurance policy. And in response, a few days later, Beatrice calls John and tells him, look, I did what you asked me to do. I changed the insurance policy.
When I heard all this in court, I was very shocked into the things that was going on and what she was doing behind Terry's back.
Although, as both Beatrice and the prosecutors stressed, she only did it because John told her to.
She would do anything for John.
But as Beatrice told the jury, once Terry was dead, she'd immediately regretted what she'd done.
I don't think she really thought this through. Her relationship with John Murray, she got wrapped up in it.
She kept on saying that she was sorry. She didn't even want any of this to happen.
That's what Beatrice claimed, but was it the truth? Not according to John's defense attorney.
She shouldn't be believed because she's going to testify against John so that her jail time is reduced.
Instead, when John's defense presented their case, the scenario they laid out was the exact opposite of what Beatrice claimed.
Almost all of it came from Beatrice. It was Beatrice who was going to change these policies, and John sort of just went along with it.
And since Beatrice's testimony was the only thing that directly connected John to the crime, the defense maintained that he was completely innocent.
John was just adamant that he did not commit this crime.
And they reminded the jury that the prosecutors had no murder weapon and no evidence to actually put him in Terry's car.
They are circumstantial. Could be coincidences. It could be a different car. It could have been anyone who drove that phone and threw it up there.
And the call from his phone that pointed to him in the first place. The defense claimed that John wasn't the one who made that call.
He had given that phone to Beatrice Camper before the day of the homicide.
Beatrice had actually provided John with that phone so they can talk privately anytime Beatrice and John wanted.
But why would John give Beatrice back the phone that served as their secret hotline?
John had, in fact, ended the relationship with Beatrice. And Beatrice was very upset with the fact that John no longer wanted to be with her. That was not acceptable to Beatrice. She continued to pursue John even after the fact.
And according to the defense, it was Beatrice who had killed Terry.
John Murray put everything on her, that she shot him, and he was pushing it on her.
The defense claimed that Beatrice had not only murdered Terry, they said that she was obsessed with John Murray, and she had intentionally dumped her dead husband's phone on the way to John's house to frame her ex-boyfriend for the murder.
We tried to put it on Beatrice entirely that it was her, and that was John's argument, and that's what we felt the evidence showed.
Coming up, the jury makes its decision.
There's a lot of tension in the courtroom.
But will they believe Beatrice?
John was beside himself.
On April 17, 2014, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the murder trial of Beatrice Camper's ex-boyfriend, John Murray.
They deliberated for the better part of a day.
The 62-year-old ex-con was accused of killing Beatrice's husband, Terry.
Her and John planned this together.
At least that's what Beatrice had testified in court as part of her plea deal.
The DA's office offered her a fixed amount of time in jail, and in return for that, she would have to testify against John.
John's defense, on the other hand, argued that Beatrice was Terry's killer.
They both was blaming each other.
What's more, according to the defense, Beatrice had set up John to take the fall for her crime after John put an end to their affair.
Beatrice was pointing this on him based on the fact that he had a bad prior record.
I think Beatrice is a very manipulative person.
And in the end, the case basically came down to who the jury believed, Beatrice or John.
There was a lot of tension in the courtroom.
John knew what the stakes were. He knew that he was looking at a lifetime sentence without the possibility of parole.
But would he get it?
The jury found John Murray guilty of murder.
John was very upset at the verdict. He was beside himself.
And he was going to prison for life.
He would never see daylight again, per the judge. And I agree with that. And he got just what he deserved.
But what about Beatrice? She was technically serving life too, but the terms of her plea deal meant that parole was an option.
She's looking at, 15 years to life.
And the thought that Beatrice could get out in as little as 15 years leaves Terry's family more than a little disappointed.
I think she'd need to be in prison the rest of her life.
The family is determined to see that she stays there, too.
When she goes before the board, the family will plan to be there to say she deserves to stay longer.
And despite the deal the prosecutors made in order to put John in prison, the investigators basically agree with Terry's family.
To have such a premeditation involved, to have plans having been made for so long to do this, and she's just as guilty as the man who pulled the trigger. There's plenty of opportunity for these two to say, what are we thinking here? This is horrible. We can't do this. No, they kept chugging along, man. They executed these plans, and they executed Terry Camper. That's just pure evil.
May 1981 cold case cracked. Buried evidence shocks investigators. The first sound anyone remembered was not a scream. It was a relentless ringing of a telephone that nobody answered. It echoed to the narrow hallway of a weather-beaten farmhouse outside Millinocket, Maine, on the evening of October 17, 1981, while cold rain hammered the roof hard enough to drown out almost everything else. By sunrise, the phone had stopped. The lights were still on. The front door stood half open. The family dog wandered aimlessly across the muddy yard, whining at the edge of the forest as if waiting for someone who would never return. When deputies arrived, nothing made sense. There was no sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no shattered windows, no blood splashed across the floor. Yet something had happened inside that house, something violent enough to erase an entire future while leaving almost no trace behind. 38-year-old Eleanor Briggs had vanished without a coat despite temperatures hovering just above freezing. Her coffee still steamed gently on the kitchen table when neighbors first entered. The newspaper remained folded beside it, untouched except for a damp fingerprint that investigators would later discover belonged to no one they could identify. Her purse remained hanging beside the door. Her car keys rested neatly inside a ceramic bowl. Her paycheck had never been cashed. Nothing suggested she intended to leave. Everything suggested someone wanted investigators to believe she simply disappeared. Within hours, the story spread across Penobscot County. A respected elementary school teacher, a quiet woman, no known enemies, no financial problems, no history of running away. The headlines came quickly. Maine woman vanishes without a trace. Small town shaken by mysterious disappearance. Residents locked their doors for the first time in years. Parents stopped allowing children to walk home alone. Hunters entering the endless forest carried more than rifles. They carried fear. Detectives searched every inch of Eleanor's property. Fresh boot prints led toward the woods before disappearing across rocky ground. A flashlight lay beneath a pine tree, less than 200 yards from the house. Its batteries were still warm. Nobody could explain why. Search dogs picked up Eleanor sent behind the barn before abruptly circling in confusion, as though she had stepped into thin air. Helicopters scanned miles of forest. Volunteers combed rivers, abandoned logging roads, frozen marshes, and forgotten cabins. Nothing. Not a shoe. Not a strand of hair. Not a single drop of blood. The disappearance quickly transformed into something far darker than a missing person investigation. It became a puzzle with missing pieces that no one could find. Neighbors began talking. Some claimed they had seen unfamiliar headlights parked along the county road several nights before Eleanor vanished. Others insisted they heard an engine idling shortly after midnight. One elderly resident reported hearing what sounded like a woman shouting from deep inside the forest, but heavy rain swallowed every word before he could understand. Police chased every lead. Every single one collapsed. Then came the first strange discovery. 3 weeks after Eleanor disappeared, a volunteer searching an abandoned logging trail found a red wool scarf hanging from a broken cedar branch nearly 12 miles away. The scarf belonged to Eleanor. It carried no blood, no tears, no fingerprints except her own. Investigators wondered whether someone had deliberately placed it there after search teams had already passed through the area. If that were true, someone had been watching. Someone knew exactly where police were looking, and someone wanted the investigation to continue in circles. The discovery fueled panic across the county. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. A traveling drifter, a jealous lover, a serial killer moving through New England, an escaped psychiatric patient. Every theory found believers. None found proof. Detective Harold Mercer, a veteran investigator with nearly 25 years of experience, privately admitted the case unsettled him unlike any other. Experienced criminals made mistakes. Desperate suspects left evidence. Violence always left scars. This crime had left almost nothing. He walked through Eleanor's farmhouse again and again. He measured distances, reconstructed timelines, examined furniture, studied family photographs. One detail refused to leave his mind. Every clock inside the house had stopped at exactly 9:17. The kitchen clock, the bedroom alarm clock, a decorative wall clock, even the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Mechanical failure could explain one, maybe two, not four. Electricians found no explanation. The clocks simply stopped. Some townspeople whispered about curses. Others blamed lightning despite clear weather records showing no strikes within miles that evening. Mercer ignored superstition. Still, he wrote one sentence inside his notebook. Someone wanted time to stop here. Months passed. Winter buried northern Maine beneath mountains of snow. The search slowed. Leads dried up. Families returned to routines they no longer enjoyed. Yet Eleanor Briggs remained missing. Her classroom sat empty until another teacher reluctantly accepted the position. Children still asked when she was coming back. No one knew how to answer. Then another shock arrived. A local hunter discovered tire tracks preserved beneath early snowfall near an abandoned gravel pit almost 18 miles from Eleanor's home. The tracks appeared old. Investigators matched the pattern to a discontinued pickup tire manufactured during the late 1970s. Only a handful of vehicles in the county used that model. Hope surged. Police interviewed every owner. Every truck checked out. Some had been sold years earlier. Others had been scrapped. One owner had died before Eleanor disappeared. Another had moved across the country. The trail dissolved again. As spring returned in 1982, anonymous phone calls began reaching the sheriff's office. The caller never spoke, only breathing, slow, calm, patient, always exactly 17 seconds. Then silence. The calls continued for months. Tracing technology of the era offered little help. Public payphones, disconnected lines, dead ends. Investigators suspected someone connected to the case. They could never prove it. Meanwhile, Eleanor's younger brother Thomas refused to stop searching. Every weekend he entered forests carrying maps covered in handwritten notes. He marked every abandoned shack, every hidden pond, every collapsed mine entrance. Friends begged him to move on. He refused. He believed someone was still waiting to be found. Years slipped by. The headlines disappeared. New crimes replaced old mysteries. Fresh tragedies filled newspaper columns once occupied by Eleanor's photograph. Boxes of evidence migrated into a dim storage room beneath the county courthouse. Dust settled. Memories faded. Children who remembered their favorite teacher graduated, married, and had families of their own. The farmhouse stood abandoned, its paint peeled, windows cracked, vines climbed across weathered walls. Teenagers dared each other to enter after sunset. Many claimed the old hallway clock sometimes ticked despite having no working mechanism inside. Ghost stories replaced police reports. The official file remained painfully thin. Missing woman. No body. No suspect. No arrest. Cold case. But every October, fresh flowers appeared quietly on Eleanor's front porch. Nobody admitted leaving them. No one ever saw who did. Detective Mercer retired in 1989, carrying one cardboard box of personal belongings and another filled with unofficial copies of the Briggs investigation. His colleagues laughed gently, telling him to leave the ghost behind. He smiled without answering. Some cases faded with time. This one grew heavier. He continued reading every newspaper clipping, every missing person report, every arrest involving former residents of Penobscot County, convinced that somewhere inside thousands of ordinary pages had one overlooked sentence capable of changing everything. For nearly 2 decades, nothing did. Then, in the spring of 2000, workers clearing land for a new section of highway uncovered something buried beneath nearly 6 feet of compacted earth. At first, it looked like nothing more than rotting timber from an abandoned structure. Then one laborer noticed rusted metal protruding from the soil. The excavation stopped immediately. State police arrived within hours. Archaeologists were called before heavy equipment resumed. No one standing at the edge of that muddy trench realized they were about to disturb evidence that had slept silently beneath the ground since the autumn night Eleanor Briggs vanished. Evidence so unexpected that even seasoned investigators would question every assumption they had carried for the previous 19 years. The trench widened beneath gray morning skies while investigators moved carefully through layers of wet soil. Construction workers stood behind temporary barriers, watching in uneasy silence. Rumors spread before noon. By evening, half the county seemed convinced a body had been found. Reporters arrived from Bangor. Satellite vans lined the roadside. State police refused to answer questions. The secrecy only fueled speculation. What emerged from the earth was not a body. It was a vehicle, a heavily corroded pickup truck crushed beneath decades of dirt and gravel. The discovery alone was unusual. The location was stranger. No record showed a truck had ever been abandoned there. No missing vehicle reports matched the area. No one could explain how an entire pickup had disappeared underground without attracting attention. Investigators spent 2 days excavating around the frame. The license plate had long since deteriorated. The paint was gone. The windshield had collapsed inward. Most identifying features had vanished beneath rust. Yet one detail immediately caught attention. The tires. Even after years underground, enough tread remained visible for comparison. Detectives stared at photographs taken 18 years earlier. The same discontinued tire pattern. The same model. The same design discovered near the abandoned gravel pit in 1981. Veteran officers who remembered the Briggs investigation exchanged uneasy looks. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the cold case felt alive. The truck was transported to a secured forensic facility. Every inch was photographed, every fragment cataloged. The cab yielded little at first. Rotten upholstery, broken glass, animal nests, corrosion, nothing obviously connected to Eleanor Briggs. Then technicians removed the driver's seat. Beneath it lay a rusted metal container sealed tightly enough to survive decades underground. Inside, they found a handful of ordinary items. A flashlight, a pocket knife, a cigarette lighter, and a folded piece of paper. The paper nearly disintegrated when touched. Specialists spent weeks preserving it. When the writing finally became visible, investigators felt the atmosphere inside the lab change instantly. A name appeared on the page. Not Eleanor's. Not anyone investigators recognized. Just a name. Samuel Reed. No address. No explanation. No context. Only 2 words written beneath it. Don't trust him. The note generated more questions than answers. Detectives searched local records. Nothing. No connection to Eleanor. No connection to the property. No connection to any suspect ever investigated. The lead seemed destined for another dead end, until a retired detective watching the evening news nearly dropped his coffee. Harold Mercer had not heard the name in years, but he recognized it immediately. Not from the Briggs file, from somewhere else, somewhere buried in old memories. He disappeared into his basement and began opening dusty boxes filled with notebooks collected during decades of police work. Hours passed. Then dawn arrived. Mercer found what he was looking for, a yellowing report from 1978, 3 years before Eleanor vanished. A brief investigation involving trespassing complaints near an abandoned logging camp outside Millinocket. One witness had mentioned a seasonal laborer, a quiet man, kept to himself, drove an older pickup truck. His name was Samuel Reed. The complaint had gone nowhere. The report had been forgotten. Mercer immediately contacted state police. Investigators located Samuel Reed's records. The discovery shocked them. Reed had vanished in 1983, 2 years after Eleanor disappeared. No family, no known residents, no missing person investigation beyond a short local inquiry. He had simply ceased to exist. The coincidence felt impossible to ignore. A missing woman, a missing laborer, a buried truck, a warning note. The Cold Case Task Force reopened the Briggs investigation officially. Boxes untouched since the Reagan administration were hauled from storage. Evidence was re-examined. Photographs were scanned digitally. Witness statements were reviewed. Names forgotten by time resurfaced. One of those names belonged to Martha Keegan. In 1981, Martha lived less than a mile from Eleanor's farmhouse. She was 78 years old when detectives interviewed her again. Age had softened her voice but sharpened certain memories. She told investigators something she had never mentioned before, something she claimed sounded too ridiculous to report at the time. The night Eleanor vanished, she woke around 9 o'clock after hearing a vehicle outside. She looked through her window. She saw headlights. Then she saw another light, a flashlight moving between the trees. At first she assumed hunters. Then she noticed something unusual. The flashlight appeared to blink in a deliberate pattern. Short flashes, pauses, more flashes, like a signal. Investigators asked why she never reported it. Her answer chilled the room. Because 2 days later, someone left a dead crow on her porch. Its wings had been nailed open. No note, no explanation. She believed it was a warning, and she stayed silent for 19 years. Detectives left the interview shaken. The detail had never appeared anywhere in the original file. Neither had the dead crow. Mercer reviewed old notes again. Something began bothering him. The stop clocks. The flashlight found beneath the pine tree. The signaling light Martha described. The warm batteries. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they suggested planning, communication, coordination, more than one person. The possibility changed everything. For years, investigators assumed a lone offender. Now they considered a group, a conspiracy, perhaps small, perhaps not. Forensic analysts, meanwhile, continued examining the buried truck. Weeks later, another breakthrough emerged. Hidden inside a cavity behind the dashboard sat a cloth pouch sealed from moisture. Inside were several items preserved remarkably well. A cheap wristwatch, 3 photographs, and a key. The watch had stopped at exactly 9:17, the same time every clock inside Eleanor's farmhouse had stopped. Detectives stared at the report in disbelief. Coincidence suddenly seemed much harder to accept. The photographs deepened the mystery. One showed a logging road. Another showed a small cabin. The third showed Eleanor Briggs standing outside a grocery store. The image appeared to have been taken secretly from a distance. She was unaware she was being photographed. Someone had been watching her, perhaps for weeks, perhaps longer. Investigators enlarged every detail visible in the background: storefront signs, vehicles, street markings. Eventually, they estimated the photograph was taken less than 10 days before her disappearance. The discovery transformed the case. Eleanor had not been selected randomly. She had been targeted. The question was why. Former students describe her as kind. Co-workers describe her as ordinary. Family describe her as private. Nothing explained why someone would secretly photograph her. Then detectives uncovered a forgotten detail buried inside school records. During the late 1970s, Eleanor volunteered with literacy programs serving seasonal workers employed in remote logging camps. The camps attracted transient laborers from across New England, including potentially Samuel Reed. Investigators suddenly had a possible connection. It wasn't much, but after decades of nothing, it felt enormous. The task force began searching for surviving workers from those camps. Many had died. Others moved away. Some could not be located. A few agreed to speak. One former logger provided information that immediately captured investigators' attention. He remembered Samuel Reed, not because Reed was friendly, because everyone feared him. According to the witness, Reed frequently disappeared for days at a time. Nobody knew where he went. Nobody asked. He carried large amounts of cash despite earning little. And occasionally he met strangers in the woods at night. Men nobody recognized. Vehicles with out-of-state plates. Meetings conducted far from campfires and work crews. The witness remembered another detail. Reed once became furious after discovering someone had entered his cabin. For days he accused co-workers of stealing a metal box he kept hidden beneath floorboards. Nobody admitted taking it. The box was never found. Investigators wondered if that missing box and the buried container recovered from the truck were somehow connected. The deeper they dug, the stranger the story became. Yet despite new evidence, they still lacked the one thing needed to solve the mystery: a body. Without Eleanor, key questions remained locked in darkness. Was she murdered, abducted, held somewhere? Did she die the night she vanished or years later? No one knew. Then, during a review of aerial photographs taken shortly after the original search effort in 1981, an analyst noticed something that everyone else had missed: a disturbance in the forest. A narrow patch of earth approximately 20 feet long, barely visible, located less than 3 miles from the Briggs farmhouse. Search teams had passed nearby dozens of times, but never directly over it. The image was grainy, the anomaly subtle, easy to overlook. Yet now, viewed through modern enhancement software, it appeared unmistakable. Something had altered the ground there shortly after Eleanor disappeared. Within days, investigators prepared to enter the forest. What they would uncover beneath those trees would resurrect fears buried for decades and reveal that the mystery surrounding Eleanor Briggs was far larger than anyone had imagined. The revelation changed the entire direction of the investigation. For 19 years, authorities had been searching for a missing woman. Now, they were searching for a hidden accomplice. The phrase from the recording, "Keep the clock stopped," became the sentence that haunted every investigator assigned to the case. It was not a random remark. It was a message, a command, a clue left behind by someone who believed the truth would never surface. But the discovery of Eleanor Briggs's remains created another problem. Calvin Rourke was dead. The man investigators believed responsible could never stand in a courtroom. The evidence recovered from the burial sites was overwhelming. But prosecutors needed more than a dead suspect. They needed a complete timeline. They needed to know who helped him. They needed to understand why Eleanor was targeted. The investigation expanded overnight. Former residents were interviewed again. Old friendships were examined. Forgotten relationships were pulled apart. The town that had spent decades trying to forget the case was forced to remember every uncomfortable detail. And then investigators found something buried inside the original case files. A single page that had been ignored. A handwritten note from Deputy Alan Pierce. one of the first officers who responded to Eleanor's farmhouse in 1981. The note was never entered into the official evidence summary. It contained only 3 sentences. Second set of muddy footprints near back entrance, not matching victim's shoes. Sheriff instructed removal from report. The discovery stunned the current investigation team. Why had the footprints been removed? Who ordered it? And why? Deputy Pierce had died years earlier, but his surviving family allowed investigators to search through his personal records. Inside an old metal filing cabinet, they found a sealed envelope marked, "Briggs, do not destroy." Inside was a photograph, not from the farmhouse, not from the search area, from a location nobody had ever connected to the case. The photograph showed Eleanor Briggs standing beside another person outside a small roadside diner 3 days before her disappearance. The image was grainy. The other person's face was partially hidden, but investigators recognized the jacket, a dark green logging coat, the same style Calvin Rourke was known to wear. For the first time, authorities had proof that Rourke and Eleanor knew each other. The original investigation had concluded they were strangers. That assumption had shaped everything, every search, every interview, every theory, but it had been wrong. The question now became, what was the connection between a respected teacher and a secretive logging contractor? Investigators dug into Eleanor's private life. They discovered she had recently become involved in a community project documenting illegal dumping in the forests around Penobscot County. She had photographed abandoned chemical containers, destroyed wildlife areas, and suspicious activity near remote logging properties. One name appeared repeatedly in her notes: Calvin Rourke. Eleanor had written that Rourke's company was operating on land where environmental violations had been reported, but she had never filed an official complaint. Why? Because according to a journal recovered from her attic, she believed someone inside local government was protecting him. The final entry in the journal was dated October 16, 1981, one day before she vanished. The handwriting became rushed near the bottom of the page. I know who has been moving the barrels. I know who has been covering it up. If anything happens to me, check the old quarry road. The discovery sent investigators back to the quarry, the same location where Eleanor's remains had been found, the same location where evidence had been buried, the same location police had never searched in 1981. A mistake that haunted retired investigators. A mistake that allowed a killer's secret to remain underground for nearly 2 decades. As detectives reconstructed the final week of Eleanor's life, a disturbing picture emerged. She had not vanished randomly. She had been investigating something. Something powerful enough to frighten people. Something connected to hidden operations in the forests of Maine. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Who else was involved? The investigation turned toward individuals who had escaped attention in 1981. Among them was former County Commissioner Walter Hale. At the time of Eleanor's disappearance, Hale had been responsible for approving several logging permits throughout the region. He had also been one of the first public officials to declare Eleanor's disappearance likely voluntary, a statement that angered her family. Investigators reviewed archived interviews. Hale appeared unusually eager to explain the case. Before police had confirmed any evidence, he publicly suggested Eleanor had simply left town. That detail had bothered Mercer for years. Now it looked different. Investigators searched Hale's old properties and found financial records showing payments made to several logging companies, including Rourke's operation, shortly after Eleanor began documenting illegal activity. The amounts were small, not enough to immediately prove corruption, but enough to raise questions. Then came the breakthrough nobody expected. A former employee from Rourke's logging company contacted police. His name was Daniel Voss. He had been 22 years old in 1981. For years, he had lived under the weight of a secret. He told investigators he had seen Eleanor's vehicle near Rourke's logging camp on the night she disappeared. He had seen Rourke, and he had seen another person, a government vehicle parked beside the camp. Voss said he was afraid to speak because Rourke threatened him. But the reason he finally came forward after nearly 20 years was even more shocking. He claimed someone had recently entered his house and left an envelope on his kitchen table. Inside was a single photograph, a photograph of Eleanor Briggs. On the back, for words were written, some secret stayed buried. Investigators treated the threat as a sign that someone connected to the case was still alive, still watching, still afraid. They placed Voss under protection and began searching for whoever had delivered the photograph. Security cameras from nearby businesses provided no clear image. The person had worn dark clothing, moved carefully, avoided main roads, almost as if they knew exactly how investigators would look. Then forensic testing on the old cassette tape produced another discovery. The audio contained background noise previously dismissed as static. After advanced enhancement, analysts identified a second voice, a woman, whispering, repeating the same sentence. He promised nobody would know. The investigation changed again. This was no longer about one killer. It was about a group, a secret that had survived for decades, a conspiracy hidden beneath ordinary life in a small Maine community. And as investigators reopened every forgotten file, they discovered something terrifying. The original case had not failed because evidence disappeared. It had failed because evidence had been buried, not only in the ground, but inside the system itself. The question now was no longer who killed Eleanor Briggs. The question was how many people had spent 38 years making sure nobody ever found out. The answer was hidden inside the silence. For decades, the people in northern Maine had believed Eleanor Briggs disappeared because someone wanted her gone. But the reopened investigation revealed something much more disturbing. Someone wanted her forgotten. There was a difference. A missing person creates questions. A forgotten person creates no questions at all. And that was exactly what had happened. For 38 years, Eleanor's name had slowly faded from newspapers, from conversations, from public memory. Her photograph remained in an old case file. Her story remained in the minds of a few people who refused to let go. Everyone else moved forward. But buried beneath the forest, beneath abandoned roads, beneath layers of government paperwork, the truth had been waiting. Investigators began reconstructing the final 24 hours of Eleanor Briggs's life. The timeline was incomplete, but the pieces were finally beginning to connect. On October 17, 1981, Eleanor left her school shortly after 4 p.m. Witnesses remembered her carrying a brown folder filled with documents. She appeared nervous, distracted. A colleague later recalled that Eleanor had stopped before leaving and said something unusual. If I'm right, people are going to be very angry. At the time, nobody understood what she meant. Now investigators believe that folder contained evidence connected to illegal dumping operations near the logging areas, evidence that could expose people with influence. That folder was never found, not in her farmhouse, not in her car, not in any search area. It was as if someone had taken only the information that could destroy them. At 6:43 p.m., Eleanor's car was seen near a small diner outside town. The same diner from the photograph, recovered from Deputy Pierce's records. A waitress remembered Eleanor sitting with a man wearing a green logging jacket. She remembered something else. Eleanor looked afraid, not angry, not upset, afraid. The waitress had assumed it was a personal argument. She never imagined she was watching the final hours of a woman who would become Maine's most haunting cold case. The man sitting across from Eleanor was confirmed to be Calvin Rourke. But investigators still needed to identify the second person, the person connected to the government vehicle, the person whose involvement had been erased from the original investigation. The answer came from an unexpected place, a storage unit rented under a false name. The unit had belonged to Calvin Rourke. After his death, nobody had searched it because his family claimed everything had been cleared out years earlier. But when detectives checked old rental records, they discovered payments continued for 6 months after Rourke died. Someone had access. Someone was maintaining the storage unit. Inside, investigators found boxes of documents, photographs, and audio tapes. Most were meaningless. Old invoices, logging paperwork, equipment records. Then they found a file labeled EB. The contents were devastating. Copies of Eleanor's environmental reports, photographs she had taken, maps of remote logging roads, and dozens of pages documenting illegal activity. But the most important document was a handwritten agreement, a payment record, a list of names. At the bottom was a signature. Walter Halle, the former county commissioner, the same man who had publicly dismissed Eleanor's disappearance, the same man who had helped convince the community she had simply left, the same man who had never been treated as a suspect. The discovery caused an immediate storm. Federal investigators joined the case. Old corruption allegations were reopened. Former officials were questioned. Retired officers were interviewed. The small town that had spent decades defending its reputation suddenly faced a painful reality. The person who should have protected the community may have helped destroy it. But there was still one missing piece: the murder itself. The evidence suggested Rourke and Hale were involved. The motive was becoming clear, but investigators needed proof that connected them directly to Eleanor's death. Then forensic specialists examining the original cassette tape found something hidden beneath the audio layers: a vehicle horn, a specific model, a distinctive two-tone pattern. The sound matched a vehicle registered to Walter Hale in 1981. A vehicle investigators discovered had been reported stolen 3 days after Eleanor disappeared. The theft report had been dismissed as insurance fraud. Now it appeared to be something else. A cover story. The investigation moved faster. Search warrants were issued. Former Hale properties were examined. And inside the walls of an old hunting cabin belonging to Hale's family, investigators found something impossible: a hidden compartment. Inside was a collection of items preserved in plastic. Eleanor's missing classroom folder, her photographs, her handwritten notes, and a final letter she had written but never delivered. The letter was addressed to the state attorney's office. The first sentence changed everything. "I believe I have uncovered a network operating through local officials and private contractors." The second sentence was even more chilling. "They know I have the evidence." The letter ended abruptly. No signature, no date, as if Eleanor had been interrupted while writing it. Investigators now understood. She had not been planning to run. She had been preparing to expose them. The discovery destroyed every remaining doubt. But the case was not over. Walter Hale was still alive. At 81 years old, he lived quietly in a coastal Maine town, surrounded by neighbors who described him as polite, generous, and harmless. The arrest shocked everyone. News helicopters followed his every move. Reporters surrounded his home. The man who once stood beside police during the search for Eleanor Briggs was now the person they were investigating. During questioning, Hale denied everything. He claimed Rourke acted alone. He claimed Eleanor was obsessed with conspiracy theories. He claimed the documents found in his cabin had been planted. But investigators noticed one thing. When shown the photograph from the diner, Hale did not ask who the other person was. He already knew. That reaction became one of the strongest psychological indicators investigators recorded. But evidence mattered more than reactions, and the evidence continued to grow. DNA testing on preserved materials recovered from Rourke's storage unit revealed traces belonging to multiple individuals. One belonged to Eleanor, one belonged to Rourke, and one belonged to an unknown person. A person investigators had not yet identified. The case had cracked open, but inside that opening was another mystery, because the evidence suggested Walter Hale and Calvin Rourke were not the only people protecting the secret. Someone else had been there that night. Someone else helped bury the truth. And somewhere in Maine, someone had spent 38 years believing they had escaped, until investigators uncovered one final clue hidden among Eleanor Briggs's forgotten belongings. A small piece of paper, a handwritten list, 5 names, for already connected to the investigation. The 5th name was one nobody expected, a person who had spent decades publicly searching for Eleanor, a person the entire community trusted, a person who had been standing in the center of the investigation from the very beginning. The discovery of the 5th name changed the case from a hidden crime into a betrayal. For years, the people of Millinocket believed they knew who had fought for Eleanor Briggs. They remembered the volunteers searching through freezing forests. They remembered neighbors hanging missing person posters. They remembered the family members who refused to accept that she was gone. But now investigators were forced to ask a terrifying question. What if someone close to the investigation had not been searching for Eleanor? What if they had been searching for the evidence? The handwritten list recovered from Eleanor's belongings contained 5 names. The first 4 connected to the illegal logging operation: Calvin Rourke, Walter Hale, 2 contractors who had worked under Rourke. The 5th name was different. It belonged to someone who had never been considered a suspect, someone whose reputation had remained untouched for nearly 4 decades. Thomas Briggs, Eleanor's younger brother, the man who had spent 19 years searching for us, the man who had appeared on television begging for answers, the man who told reporters he would never stop looking for his sister. The investigators who discovered the list did not immediately believe it. They thought it was impossible. Thomas had been the face of the family's pain. He had attended every anniversary memorial. He had kept Eleanor's photograph on his wall. He had fought against anyone who suggested she had disappeared voluntarily. But the evidence demanded answers. Investigators reviewed Thomas's original statements from 1981. Something stood out. Thomas had always claimed he last spoke with Eleanor 3 days before she vanished. But phone records recovered decades later showed a different story. There was a call between them the night before her disappearance. A 12-minute conversation. A conversation Thomas had never mentioned. When questioned, Thomas admitted the call happened, but he insisted it was ordinary. He said Eleanor sounded tired. He said they talk about family. He said nothing else. Investigators did not believe him, not because of the call, because of what happened afterward. The day after Eleanor disappeared, Thomas arrived at her farmhouse before police. He told officers he had come because he was worried, but nobody knew how he became worried so quickly. At the time, police assumed he had simply sensed something was wrong. Now they wondered if he knew more. The investigation team began examining Thomas's finances from 1981. They found something strange. A large payment deposited into his account 2 weeks after Eleanor vanished. The source? A company connected to one of Rourke's logging associates. Thomas claimed it was a loan. Investigators asked why he never mentioned it. He had no answer. The image of the grieving brother began to crack. But Mercer, even after decades, refused to jump to conclusions. He remembered Thomas searching. He remembered his pain. He remembered the countless weekends spent walking through forests. Could someone fake that kind of grief for 38 years? The answer was not simple. Human beings were capable of hiding unimaginable secrets. And sometimes the people closest to tragedy were the ones who understood exactly how to survive it. Investigators brought Thomas in for a formal interview. The room was quiet. No cameras. No reporters, just a table, a folder of evidence, and 38 years of unanswered questions. At first, Thomas remained calm. He repeated the same story. He loved his sister. He wanted justice. He had no connection to Rourke or Hale. Then investigators placed a handwritten list on the table. They watched his face. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then his expression collapsed. Not confusion, recognition. He knew the paper. He knew exactly what it was. The interview changed instantly. Investigators asked one question. Why was your name on Eleanor's list? Thomas stared at the page. Then he whispered something no one expected. She was never supposed to find out. The room went silent. The words were recorded. The investigation that had lasted nearly 4 decades suddenly moved at a speed nobody anticipated. Thomas requested an attorney. He refused further questions. But the damage was done. Investigators now had the missing connection, the family connection, the person who could explain why Eleanor trusted the wrong people, why she met with Rourke, why she stopped contacting friends, why evidence disappeared. The next discovery came from Thomas's own property. A search warrant uncovered a hidden box beneath the floorboards of the garage. Inside were letters, hundreds of pages. Letters written by Eleanor. Some were personal. Some discussed her investigation. Some described her growing fear. One letter contained a sentence that destroyed Thomas's final defense. Tom says he wanted to protect me, but I think he is protecting himself. The date was October 16, 1981. the day before Eleanor disappeared. Investigators now believe Thomas had known about the corruption investigation. Maybe he initially tried to help. Maybe he thought he could control the situation. Maybe he believed he was protecting his family. But somewhere along the way, he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The prosecution built a timeline. Thomas discovered Eleanor's evidence. He contacted Rourke. Rourke contacted Hale. Together, they attempted to stop Eleanor from revealing the operation, but something went wrong. Eleanor refused to surrender the evidence. She threatened to expose everyone involved. And at 9:17 p.m., the clocks inside her farmhouse stopped, the moment that marked the beginning of one of Maine's darkest mysteries. The remaining question was whether Thomas participated directly in Eleanor's death, or whether he only helped hide what happened afterward. Then forensic analysts examined the cassette tape again. This time they isolated the second voice, the whispering woman. The voice was compared against archive recordings. The match was not Thomas. It was someone else. Someone investigators had overlooked. Someone whose name had appeared nowhere in the original investigation. A woman who had lived in Millinocket in 1981. A woman who had worked with Eleanor. A woman who had been one of the first people to report her missing. Her name was Rebecca Shaw. And when investigators searched her history, they discovered something shocking. Rebecca had been the last person to see Eleanor alive. Not the waitress. Not Rourke. Not Thomas. Rebecca, she had told police in 1981 that Eleanor left school alone at 4 p.m., but phone records showed Rebecca called Eleanor's home at 8:52 that same night, minutes before the clock stopped, minutes before Eleanor vanished. The investigation had spent 38 years looking outward, looking at strangers, looking at criminals, looking at people with obvious motives. But the final secret was hidden much closer, inside friendships, inside trust, inside the people Eleanor believed would stand beside her. And as investigators prepared to confront Rebecca Shaw, they uncovered the final piece of the mystery, a confession letter, written in 1981, never sent, never found, until now. And the first line contained 4 words that would change everything. Eleanor knows about us. The letter was only 3 pages long, but those 3 pages carried the weight of 38 years of silence. Investigators read every sentence slowly, carefully, knowing that a single overlooked detail could explain everything that had remained hidden since that cold October night in 1981. The handwriting belonged to Rebecca Shaw, the woman who had been Eleanor Briggs's closest friend, the woman who had sat beside Eleanor during school meetings, the woman who had comforted Thomas Briggs in front of television cameras, the woman who had told police she believed Eleanor simply disappeared. The letter began with fear, not regret, not confusion. Fear. Eleanor knows about us. She knows what we found. She knows what we did. Investigators stared at those words for several minutes, because the meaning was clear. Rebecca was not writing about a random crime. She was writing about a secret shared by multiple people. The letter continued. Rebecca described how Eleanor had discovered financial records hidden inside school documents, records showing payments moving through several companies connected to logging operations, records that suggested money was being used to silence complaints and hide illegal activity. But the most shocking revelation was not corruption. It was Rebecca's role. She admitted she had helped organize meetings between Eleanor and people connected to the operation. At first, she claimed she was trying to help Eleanor understand what was happening. But according to the letter, everything changed when Eleanor discovered Rebecca had been receiving payments. Small amounts, monthly transfers, money described as consultation fees. Rebecca wrote that she was trapped. She feared losing her job. She feared exposure. She feared what would happen if Eleanor went public. The letter stopped halfway through a sentence. If she tells them, we all... Nothing followed. No ending. No explanation. Just an unfinished warning. Investigators immediately searched Rebecca Shaw's current residence. They expected resistance. They expected denial. Instead, they found something unexpected. Rebecca had been waiting. At 78 years old, living alone in a small coastal house, She opened the door before officers knocked. She looked at them. Then she said one sentence. "I knew this day would come." The interview lasted nearly 6 hours. For the first 3, Rebecca denied involvement. She repeated the same statements she had given in 1981. She said she loved Eleanor. She said she tried to help. She said she was also a victim. But investigators placed the evidence on the table one piece at a time. The letter, the phone records, the financial transfers, the cassette recording, the recovered documents. Finally, Rebecca stopped fighting. She looked down, and after 38 years, she told the story nobody had heard. On the night Eleanor disappeared, Rebecca had gone to the farmhouse, not to hurt her, to convince her to stop. Rebecca claimed she believed Eleanor would simply hand over the documents and walk away. She believed the situation could be controlled. But when she arrived, Rourke and Hale were already there. They were angry. They knew Eleanor had copies of evidence. They knew she planned to contact authorities. They knew time was running out. Rebecca said the argument became violent. She claimed she tried to leave. She claimed she begged them to stop, but she stayed. That was the part that haunted investigators. Rebecca stayed. She watched. She knew what happened, and afterward, she helped hide the truth. She admitted she was a person who stopped the clocks, not because of any practical reason, because Hale believed symbols mattered. He wanted the farmhouse to feel frozen, like time had stopped the moment Eleanor vanished. A message, a signature, a reminder that they controlled the story. Rebecca explained that after Eleanor was taken from the house, the group divided responsibilities. Rourke handled the burial. Hale handled the official explanations. Thomas handled the family. And Rebecca handled the investigation. The last statement shocked detectives. "What do you mean, handle the investigation?" Rebecca looked at them. Then she answered, "I made sure you looked everywhere except where she was." The confession revealed how the case had been manipulated. Rebecca attended searches. She suggested locations. She encouraged theories. She provided information that seemed helpful but always moved investigators away from the truth. She was not hiding from the investigation. She was inside it. That realization explained why the case had remained unsolved for so long. The killer was never outside the investigation. The killer was guiding it. The news broke nationwide. The headline appeared everywhere. May 1981 cold case cracked. Hidden conspiracy revealed after 38 years. People who had followed the case for decades reacted with disbelief. Neighbors who remember Rebecca as kind and compassionate struggled to understand. How could someone appear so normal while carrying such a devastating secret? How could someone attend memorials while knowing the truth? How could someone comfort a grieving family while hiding the answers? But the investigation was not finished. Rebecca's confession created another problem. She blamed Rourke. She blamed Hale. She blamed Thomas. But she denied personally causing Eleanor's death. The prosecution needed to determine responsibility. Who delivered the final act? Who made the decision Eleanor would never return home? Forensic experts returned to the evidence. The drum, the rope fibers, the preserved clothing, the photographs, and then they found something hidden in the oldest evidence of all, the scarf discovered in 1981, the scarf that had been dismissed as a meaningless clue. Advanced DNA testing revealed a mixture of genetic material, Eleanor's, Rourke's, and another person. The unknown DNA belonged to Rebecca Shaw. For the first time, physical evidence placed her directly at the center of the crime scene. Rebecca changed her story again. She admitted touching the scarf. She admitted being near Eleanor, but she insisted she never intended for anyone to die. She claimed she was afraid. She claimed she was manipulated. The investigators asked one question. If you were afraid, why did you spend 38 years protecting them? Rebecca had no answer, because that was a question that defined the entire case. Fear could explain silence. Fear could explain hesitation. But 38 years was something else. 38 years was a choice. As prosecutors prepared charges, the town of Millinocket faced the uncomfortable truth that its darkest secret had survived because ordinary people had allowed it to survive. A businessman, a public official, a brother, a friend, all connected by one decision: to let Eleanor Briggs disappear. But even after the confession, one mystery remained: the missing folder. The original evidence Eleanor had collected before her death. The documents that started everything. Without them, investigators knew the full network might never be exposed. Then, during a final search of Rebecca Shaw's property, officers found a hidden compartment beneath an old wooden staircase. Inside was a weathered envelope. No name, no address, only one word written across the front: Eleanor. The envelope had remained untouched for nearly 4 decades. Inside was the final piece of the puzzle. A document that revealed the truth was even larger than investigators imagined, because Eleanor Briggs had not only discovered illegal activity, she had discovered someone had been protecting it for years. And the name written at the bottom of that document was not Rourke, not Hale, not Rebecca. The document inside the envelope was only 1 page. But when investigators unfolded it beneath the bright lights of the evidence room, nobody spoke. For decades, they believed Eleanor Briggs had been killed because she discovered corruption inside a small group of powerful people. They believed the secret was limited to a few criminals: a logging contractor, a corrupt official, a handful of people desperate to protect themselves. But the name written at the bottom of Eleanor's final discovery revealed something much larger. Something that reached beyond one town, beyond one company, beyond one crime. The signature belonged to a person whose name appeared throughout Maine's public records during the 1980s. A person who had never been connected to the case. A person who had spent years publicly demanding justice for Eleanor. Former Sheriff Daniel Whitmore. The man who led the first search operation. The man who stood beside Thomas Briggs during press conferences. The man who told reporters in 1981, "We will not stop until we find out what happened to Eleanor." For 38 years, the community believed those words represented dedication. Now investigators wondered if they represented something else: control. Whitmore had been the person directing the investigation. He had approved search locations. He had reviewed evidence. He had decided which leads received attention. He had been the person who removed Deputy Pierce's report about the second set of footprints. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. The possibility was horrifying. The person responsible for finding Eleanor may have been responsible for hiding her. Investigators reopened every decision made during the original case. Every search route, every rejected theory, every missing piece of evidence. A pattern emerged. The mistakes were not random. They consistently protected the same people. The quarry was never searched. Rourke's logging camp was ignored. Witnesses who reported suspicious activity were dismissed. Evidence that pointed toward insiders disappeared from official reports. It was not incompetence. It was direction. Someone had been steering the investigation away from the truth, and that someone had worn a badge. Former Sheriff Whitmore had died in 2007. Like Rourke, he would never face a courtroom, but his records remained. And inside archive files from the Sheriff's Department, investigators found something impossible: a private notebook, hidden behind a false panel inside his old office desk. The notebook contained dates, names, payments, meetings. The final page was dated October 17th, 1981, the night Eleanor disappeared. The entry contained only one sentence: "The problem is contained." Investigators stare at the words. Contained. Not solved. Not resolved. Contained. A word chosen by someone who viewed a person's life as a problem to manage. The investigation expanded again. Federal agencies reviewed decades of financial records. They uncovered a network involving illegal waste disposal, falsified permits, and bribery. Eleanor had not simply discovered a local crime. She had uncovered a system protected by people who understood exactly how power worked in a small community. But the biggest mystery remained. Why had Eleanor trusted the wrong people? Why had she gone to them instead of directly contacting authorities? The answer came from her final journal entries. Eleanor had believed the system could be fixed from within. She believed people would choose the right side when confronted with the truth. That belief had cost her everything. One entry stood out. I don't think everyone involved is evil. I think some people are afraid. Fear makes people do terrible things. Investigators believe this explained Rebecca Shaw, Thomas Briggs, even some of the lesser participants. They were not all masterminds. Some were frightened people who made one terrible choice, then another, until the choices became impossible to undo. The final months of the investigation focused on proving exactly what happened inside Eleanor's farmhouse. Rebecca's confession provided the timeline. Forensic evidence provided the connection. But one question remained unanswered. Who made the final decision to kill Eleanor? The answer came from a hidden audio recording discovered in Whitmore's notebook collection. The tape was damaged. Parts were missing, but one section was clear. A conversation recorded weeks after Eleanor's disappearance. 3 voices, Rourke, Hale, and Whitmore. The discussion was not about whether Eleanor was alive. They already knew. The discussion was about protecting themselves. Whitmore's voice could be heard saying, "The longer this goes, the safer we are." That sentence became the foundation of the final report. The investigation concluded Eleanor's disappearance was not a single act of violence. It was a coordinated cover-up, a chain of decisions, a group of people who each played a role. Some buried evidence. Some manipulated investigators. Some remained silent. And all of them allowed a family to spend decades searching for answers they already knew. When the findings were released, the Briggs family held a press conference. Thomas stood before the cameras. Older, exhausted, carrying the weight of a lifetime. He did not defend himself. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply looked at Eleanor's photograph and said, "My sister spent her life looking for the truth. The least we could do was finally find it." The statement became the final public moment of a case that had haunted Maine for nearly 4 decades. But even after arrests were made and the investigation officially closed, something remained unsettling. Because the question was not only how Eleanor Briggs died. The deeper question was how many people had walked past the truth every day. How many neighbors had suspected something. How many officials had looked away. How many opportunities existed to save her. And how many times did someone choose silence instead? Years later, the farmhouse where Eleanor disappeared was demolished. The land was cleared. The old walls were removed. The hallway where the clock stopped at 9:17 disappeared forever. But the story remained. A reminder that cold cases are not only about missing evidence. Sometimes they are about buried memories, forgotten decisions, and secret protected by time itself. The final report on the Briggs investigation ended with a sentence written by the lead investigator. The truth was never lost. It was hidden. And for the people of Maine, that sentence became the final chapter of the case that refused to die. The case that began with a ringing telephone in an empty farmhouse. The case that survived 38 years of silence. The case that proved the most dangerous secrets are not always hidden in abandoned forests. Sometimes they are hidden in plain sight, behind familiar faces, inside trusted institutions, and among the people everyone believed would be searching for the truth. The official closure of the Briggs investigation brought no celebration. There were no fireworks, no feeling of victory, only silence, because finding the truth did not erase what happened. It did not return Eleanor Briggs to her classroom. It did not give her students the chance to hear her voice again. It did not give her brother back 38 years of memories stolen by unanswered questions. The investigation had solved the mystery, but it could not repair the damage left behind. In the months following the announcement, investigators continued examining thousands of pages of evidence. The case file had grown from a thin folder in a forgotten archive into one of the largest investigations ever assembled in northern Maine. Every photograph was re-examined. Every witness statement was reviewed. Every decision from 1981 was questioned. And with every discovery, investigators found another reminder that Eleanor had been fighting alone. One of the most haunting discoveries came from the recovered school folder. Inside were handwritten notes Eleanor had made during her investigation. Names, dates, locations, connections. But among those notes was something nobody expected, a list titled, People Who Might Still Help. The list contained 7 names. 6 people had either denied involvement or disappeared from the investigation over the years. The 7th name was Eleanor herself. Underneath her own name, she had written, "If I cannot trust anyone else, I must trust myself." Investigators believe that sentence revealed the mindset of a woman who realized she was surrounded by people hiding the truth. She was not unaware of the danger. She knew, she understood, but she continued anyway. That was a detail that affected even the most experienced detectives. Eleanor Briggs was not simply a victim. She was a person who saw something wrong and refused to ignore it. A teacher who spent her life telling children that doing the right thing mattered. And when she was forced to choose between safety and truth, she chose truth. The investigation also revealed another disturbing fact. The conspiracy had nearly survived forever, not because it was perfect, because it lasted long enough. The people involved counted on time. They believed memories would fade, witnesses would age, evidence would disappear, technology would never catch up. For decades, they were almost right. The first breakthrough came not from a brilliant detective, not from a confession, not from a dramatic discovery. It came because someone decided to look again. A new generation of investigators opened an old file and refused to accept that the answers were gone. They saw mistakes where others saw dead ends. They saw clues where others saw coincidence. They saw Eleanor's disappearance not as an unsolved mystery, but as an unfinished investigation. And that changed everything. The final months of the case focused on one remaining question: who knew the truth and never spoke? Investigators interviewed dozens of former residents. Some admitted they had suspected something. A few remembered strange conversations. Others recalled unusual behavior after Eleanor vanished. One former employee at the logging company revealed that Rourke had suddenly changed after 1981. He stopped drinking, stopped talking, stopped socializing. He became paranoid. The employee remembered Rourke once saying, "Some things are better left underground." At the time, nobody understood. Now everyone did. Another witness described seeing Rebecca Shaw crying outside Eleanor's farmhouse days after the disappearance. Not the crying of someone who had lost a friend. The crying of someone carrying a secret. The witness said Rebecca looked directly at the house and whispered, "I'm sorry." A sentence nobody heard until decades later. The evidence painted a picture of fear, manipulation, and regret. But regret was not innocence. The law could not erase responsibility. Rebecca Shaw eventually accepted a plea agreement for her role in concealing evidence and participating in the cover-up. Her remaining years were spent away from public attention. She gave one final interview before entering a private facility. The interviewer asked her why she waited so long, why she allowed Eleanor's family to suffer, why she allowed an entire town to search for answers she already knew. Rebecca looked down for several seconds. Then she answered, "Because every day I waited made the first day easier." That sentence became one of the most repeated lines connected to case, because it explained something investigators had learned repeatedly throughout their careers. Secrets rarely survive because of one powerful person. They survive because people convince themselves that silence is easier. One day becomes 1 week. 1 week becomes 1 year. 1 year becomes decades, until the truth feels impossible to reveal. It waits. The Briggs case became a symbol across Maine, not only of tragedy, but of persistence. The case was discussed in law enforcement training programs. Future investigators studied the mistakes, the missed clues, the ignored witnesses, the danger of assuming someone is innocent because they appear helpful. Because the most important lesson from the case was not about evidence. It was about perception. Investigators had spent years searching for someone hiding in the darkness. They never considered that the person hiding the truth could be standing beside them, wearing a badge, giving interviews, offering assistance, providing directions. The person everyone trusted. The final evidence review was completed in 2024. The original farmhouse photographs were digitized. The old audio tapes were restored. The handwritten journals were preserved. The case archive became a permanent record of one of Maine's most disturbing cold cases. Inside the archive was a photograph of Eleanor Briggs taken weeks before her disappearance. She was standing outside her classroom, smiling, surrounded by students. A normal moment before everything changed. On the back of the photograph, investigators found a handwritten message. They believed Eleanor wrote it herself. Only 6 words. Truth survives longer than lies. For 38 years, those words waited, buried under paperwork, buried under fear, buried under the decisions of people who believed they had won. But they were wrong, because the truth survived, the evidence survived, and eventually the silence broke. Today, visitors driving to the forest outside Millinocket still pass the roads where investigators searched. They pass the abandoned logging paths, the old quarry, the places where people once looked for a woman they believed was gone forever. Most people passing through never know the story. They see only trees, roads, empty land. But beneath that quiet landscape remains a memory of a case that changed an entire community. A case that began with a missing woman. A case that became a decades-long battle between truth and silence. A case that proves some secrets can be buried, but they cannot stay buried forever. The final chapter of the Briggs investigation was not written inside a courtroom. It was written in the quiet places. In the empty classroom where Eleanor's name remained carved into old yearbooks. In the forest where search teams once walked through snow and darkness. In the homes of families who spent decades wondering if they would ever know the truth. Because even after the evidence was uncovered, even after names were revealed, the question that remained was not simply what happened to Eleanor Briggs. The question was what her disappearance had taken from everyone who loved her. For Thomas Briggs, the truth came with a cost. He had spent nearly 4 decades living as the grieving brother who never gave up. But after the investigation exposed his involvement in the cover-up, the image collapsed. Neighbors who once defended him stopped speaking his name. People who had comforted him during memorials struggled to understand how someone could search for a person while knowing exactly where the truth was hidden. Investigators later concluded that Thomas's role was not the same as the others. He was not the architect. He was not the person who controlled the investigation. But he made a choice that protected others, a choice that allowed a lie to continue. And that choice followed him for the rest of his life. During his final interview with investigators, Thomas looked older than his years. He no longer tried to defend himself. He no longer blamed fear. He simply said, "I thought I was saving my family. I didn't realize I was destroying it." Those words became the final statement recorded in his file. Not an excuse, not forgiveness, just an explanation from someone who knew the damage could never be undone. Meanwhile, the evidence against the remaining members of the conspiracy continued to reveal how carefully the truth had been controlled. Investigators discovered that the original search area had been altered before volunteers arrived. Maps had been changed. Routes had been redirected. Certain locations were intentionally excluded. The operation was not chaotic. It was organized. Someone had understood exactly how investigations worked. They knew where police would search. They knew what questions would be asked. They knew which details would disappear inside thousands of pages of paperwork. The greatest weapon they had was not violence. It was confusion. And for years, confusion protected them. One of the final discoveries came from a box belonging to retired detective Harold Mercer. Inside were hundreds of handwritten notes from his personal investigation, notes he kept after retirement, notes that were never officially entered into evidence. Among them was a sentence written only days after Eleanor disappeared. "Everyone is looking for a stranger. I think we should be looking at the people who already know her." For decades, Mercer carried that suspicion, but without evidence. He could not prove it. He died before seeing the case solved, before seeing Eleanor return to her family, before seeing the truth finally exposed. After his death, his former colleagues placed a copy of the final investigation report beside his old notebook, a tribute to the detective who never stopped believing the answers existed. The Briggs case also changed how cold cases were handled throughout the region. Old investigations were reopened. Archived evidence was digitized. Missing reports were reviewed. Investigators began searching for patterns that had been overlooked by previous generations. Because Eleanor's case revealed a painful reality. Time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes time preserves it. The technology changes. The methods improve. The people who committed the crime become less careful. And eventually, the past catches up. Years after the case closed, a documentary crew returned to Millinocket. They interviewed former residents, teachers who remembered Eleanor, students who grew up carrying the memory of her disappearance. One former student described Eleanor as the person who made children feel important. He remembered a sentence she repeated every year. Doing the right thing matters most when nobody is watching. That sentence stayed with him for decades. And after learning the truth, he said something that reflected what many in the community felt. She lived by those words. The people who hurt her did not. The location where Eleanor's remains were discovered became a quiet memorial site. No large monument, no dramatic display, only a simple stone marker, her name, her dates, and one sentence. The truth was found. Visitors often left flowers there, sometimes photographs, sometimes handwritten notes. Many were from people who never knew Eleanor personally, people who simply felt connected to the story. Because cold cases are not only about the victims, they are about the questions left behind, the families waiting, the communities searching, the hope that somewhere, somehow, the truth is still alive. The Briggs investigation remained one of Maine's most discussed cases because it represented something deeper than a crime. It represented the danger of believing appearances, the danger of trusting the wrong people, the danger of assuming that someone helping the investigation could never be part of the reason it failed. The final official report included hundreds of pages, evidence, timelines, statements, forensic analysis. But at the very end was a short paragraph written by the lead investigator. It did not discuss suspects. It did not discuss evidence. It discussed Eleanor. She was forgotten by those who wanted her forgotten, but she was remembered by those who loved her. That memory is what brought the truth home. And that became the final message of the May 1981 cold case. Not every mystery ends because someone confesses. Not every answer arrives quickly. Some truths spend decades waiting beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to search again, waiting for someone willing to question old assumptions, waiting for someone to look at the evidence one more time. Because the most frightening secrets are not always hidden in abandoned buildings, not always buried beneath forests, not always locked inside forgotten files. Sometimes they live among ordinary people, behind familiar smiles, inside trusted relationships. And sometimes the person everyone believes is searching for the truth is the person standing closest to the secret. For Eleanor Briggs, the clock stopped at 9:17. For 38 years, it seemed like time had won, but time was never the enemy. Time was the witness. It preserved the evidence. It carried the memories. It waited until someone finally listened. And when the ground opened, when the buried evidence was uncovered, the silence that had surrounded Eleanor Briggs for nearly 4 decades finally ended. The mystery was gone. The questions were answered, but the story remained. A warning. A cold case that proved one undeniable truth. No matter how deep the evidence is buried, eventually someone will find it. The story of Eleanor Briggs did not end when the investigation closed. In many ways, that was when the real impact began. Because solving a cold case does not erase the years lost. It does not return birthdays that passed without answers. It does not restore holidays spent wondering. It does not repair the empty chair at family gatherings. For those who loved Eleanor, justice arrived carrying the weight of everything that could never be recovered. The town of Millinocket changed after the truth came out. People who had lived there their entire lives began looking differently at familiar streets. The diner where Eleanor had been seen before her disappearance. The roads leading toward the old logging camps. The forest that had once represented peace and isolation. Places that once seemed ordinary now carried the memory of a secret that had survived for generations. Residents who had been children in 1980, remembered the fear. They remembered their parents locking doors. They remembered conversations stopping when adults entered the room. They remembered Eleanor's photograph appearing in newspapers again and again. But what they remembered most was the uncertainty. The feeling that something terrible had happened, but nobody knew what. For decades, that uncertainty became part of the town's identity. A mystery without an ending. A question without an answer. Until the ground finally gave up what had been hidden. The final investigation report revealed that the original search had come dangerously close to the truth. Only a few miles separated investigators from the locations where evidence was buried. Search teams had walked past areas connected to crime. Volunteers had stood within sight of the places where Eleanor's belongings were hidden. The truth had been there, waiting. But every investigation depends on choices. Where to search, who to question, which details matter. And in 1981, those choices were influenced by people who wanted the truth to disappear. The investigators who reopened the case studied those failures carefully. They discovered how easily a criminal investigation could be manipulated when trust replaced skepticism. The people involved were not strangers hiding in the shadows. They were familiar faces. People who shook hands with officers. People who answered questions. People who offered help. That was what made the Briggs case so disturbing. The crime itself was horrifying, but the cover-up was something different. It was slow, patient, calculated, a series of small decisions that eventually created decades of silence. One investigator described it this way. The murder happened in one night. The deception happened every day after that. Those words became the final summary of the case. Because every morning someone woke up knowing the truth. Every year someone watched Eleanor's family search. Every anniversary, someone remembered what happened. And still, the secret remained. Until it did not. The breakthrough changed the way many people viewed cold cases. For years, some believed old investigations became impossible because evidence disappeared. But the Briggs case proved something else. Evidence does not always vanish. Sometimes it waits for the right moment. DNA technology revealed what older methods could not. Digital archives uncover forgotten records. Modern investigators noticed patterns hidden inside decades of paperwork. The case was not solved because one clue appeared. It was solved because thousands of small pieces finally connected. A scarf, a photograph, a forgotten note, a hidden letter, a damaged audio tape, a sentence written in fear. Each piece alone meant little. Together, they told the story Eleanor had been trying to tell. The woman behind the cold case became more than a victim. She became the reason the truth survived. Her journal showed a person who understood the risks. She knew powerful people were involved. She knew exposing them could change her life. But she continued collecting evidence, continued asking questions, continued believing that someone would eventually listen. That belief was what investigators remembered most. Not the crime scene, not the suspects, not the decades of investigation. They remembered Eleanor's determination. Years later, former students described her as someone who always encouraged curiosity, someone who told them to question what they saw, someone who believed facts mattered. In a strange way, those lessons became the foundation of the investigation that finally solved her case. Detectives questioned assumptions. They challenged old conclusions. They looked again. And looking again changed everything. The final evidence review also uncovered one last disturbing detail. A hidden photograph from 1981 showed the farmhouse hallways shortly after investigators arrived. For decades, nobody noticed anything unusual. But when the image was enhanced, a small object appeared near the base of the wall. A piece of paper. Almost completely hidden. Investigators searched archived evidence storage. They discovered the paper had been collected but never analyzed. It had been placed inside a box marked as unrelated material. The paper contained only one sentence, written in Eleanor's handwriting. If they say I left willingly, they are lying. That sentence became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire investigation, because it proved Eleanor had anticipated exactly what would happen. She knew people might try to rewrite her story. She knew someone might claim she chose to disappear. She left behind a warning, a final attempt to protect the truth. And nearly 4 decades later, that warning was heard. The Briggs case officially became closed. But investigators involved said something important. A closed case does not mean a forgotten case. The file remains. The evidence remains. The lessons remain. Because every cold case represents a person, not a headline, not a number, not an old photograph. A person who had a life before the mystery began. Eleanor Briggs was a teacher, a sister, a friend, a woman who believed doing the right thing mattered. Her story became a reminder that behind every cold case headline is someone whose life was interrupted, someone whose family waited, someone whose name deserved to be spoken again. And in the quiet forests of Maine, where the cold wind still moved through the trees, one story remains. A story about a woman who disappeared, a town that waited, a secret that survived, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Years after the final report was released, the Briggs case continued to attract attention from investigators, journalists, and people fascinated by the mysteries of cold cases. But for those who lived through it, Eleanor's story was never about the mystery. It was always about the person behind it. Every October, when the rain returned to northern Maine and the forest turned dark beneath heavy clouds, a small group of people gathered near the memorial site. Former students, former neighbors, people who had searched for Eleanor, people who had simply heard her story and felt the weight of it. They stood quietly. No speeches, no cameras, just silence. The same silence that had surrounded the case for 38 years. But this time, the silence was different. It was not the silence of unanswered questions. It was a silence of remembrance. Because Eleanor Briggs was no longer a missing person. She was no longer a photograph on a bulletin board. She was no longer a name inside an unfinished police report. She had been found. Her story had been told. And the people who tried to bury the truth had failed. The investigation also changed how law enforcement viewed old cases involving missing persons. The Briggs case became an example of how dangerous assumptions could be. In 1981, investigators believed the person responsible was probably someone unknown, a stranger, an outsider, someone passing through. But the truth was far more complicated. The person who caused the most damage was not someone hiding from the community. It was someone trusted by the community. That realization forced investigators to rethink how they approach similar cases. They learned that familiarity could be misleading. A helpful witness could still hide secrets. A grieving family member could still hold information. A person who appears desperate for answers could sometimes be the person afraid of those answers. The case became a lesson written in evidence. Not every disappearance begins with someone leaving. Sometimes it begins with someone making sure they never return. The final analysis of Eleanor's timeline revealed details that had been missed for decades. At 8:52 p.m., the call from Rebecca Shaw reached Eleanor's farmhouse. At 9:17 p.m., the clock stopped. At 10:03 p.m., a vehicle matching Rourke's truck was recorded on a nearby road by an old weather monitoring camera. The camera was not designed for surveillance. It was simply positioned near a highway intersection to monitor traffic conditions. For years, nobody knew the footage existed. When investigators reviewed archive recordings, they found a blurred image of a truck traveling away from the area. A small detail, almost meaningless, until combined with everything else. That was the pattern of the Briggs case. No single clue solved it. The truth was hidden inside the connection between thousands of forgotten details. The scarf, the photograph, the tape, the documents, the witnesses, the mistakes. Every piece was waiting for someone to understand what it meant. The most emotional moment of the investigation came when Eleanor's personal belongings were finally returned to her family. The box was small. Inside were ordinary things. A watch, a classroom key, a notebook, a pair of glasses. Objects that once belonged to an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. But after decades of searching, those simple objects carried enormous meaning. Thomas Briggs held his sister's notebook for several minutes without speaking. Investigators who were present said he turned through the pages slowly, as if expecting to find something new. something that could change what happened. But the final page contained no hidden answer, no secret message, only a sentence Eleanor had written years before. People remember what you do. Make sure they remember something worth remembering. Those words became the final connection between the woman Eleanor was and the mystery she left behind. She had spent her life teaching others. Even after death, she continued doing the same. She taught people about courage, about consequences, about the cost of silence. The Briggs case also revealed another uncomfortable truth. Time does not make secrets disappear. It only makes people more confident that they have survived. Those responsible believed the years would protect them. They believed aging evidence would become useless. They believed witnesses would forget. They believed the world would move on. But they underestimated one thing: persistence. Because somewhere, someone always remembers. A detective keeps a notebook. A family keeps a photograph. A witness keeps a memory. A piece of evidence survives in a forgotten box. And eventually, those fragments find each other. The final interview with the lead investigator became one of the most remembered moments after the case. A reporter asked him, "After 38 years, why do you think this case was finally solved?" The investigator paused, then answered, "Because the truth had more patience than the people who tried to hide it." That sentence spread quickly, because it captured everything about Eleanor Briggs. The case was not solved because the past disappeared. It was solved because the past came back. The forest remembered, the records remembered, the evidence remembered, and eventually, people listened. Today, the road leading toward the old quarry looks ordinary. Cars pass through. Trees move in the wind. Most travelers have no idea what happened there. They do not know about the searches, the secrets, the years of silence. They see only a quiet stretch of Maine landscape. But beneath that quiet is a story that changed a community forever. A story about a woman who discovered something dangerous. A story about people who believed they could control the truth. A story about a family that refused to stop searching. And a story about a cold case that proved one thing above everything else. Buried evidence can sleep for decades, but it never forgets. The years following the resolution of the Briggs case brought something the community had not expected. Not peace, not completely, because some wounds do not close when the truth is revealed. Some wounds simply stop bleeding. For the people who spent decades searching for Eleanor, the discovery of what happened was both an ending and a beginning. They finally knew where she had been. They finally knew who betrayed her. They finally understood why the investigation had failed. But knowledge came with its own burden. The truth was heavier than the mystery. For 38 years, people had imagined countless possibilities. Maybe Eleanor had left town. Maybe she had started a new life somewhere far away. Maybe one day she would walk back through the door of her farmhouse. Those impossible hopes had kept some people going. But when the evidence was uncovered, those hopes disappeared forever. The finality was painful. Yet many said the uncertainty had been worse. Because uncertainty creates endless questions. Truth creates an answer, even a devastating answer. Eleanor's former classroom became a place where people gathered after the case was solved. The old school building had changed over the years. New classrooms were built. Old hallways were renovated. New generations of students walked through doors that Eleanor once opened every morning. Most of them never knew her, but her story remained. Teachers told them about the woman who believed curiosity mattered, the woman who encouraged students to ask questions, the woman who proved that doing the right thing sometimes requires courage. A small plaque was placed outside classroom. It did not mention the crime. It did not mention the suspects. Because those who loved her wanted people to remember her life, not only the tragedy that ended it. Meanwhile, investigators continued studying the case long after it officially closed. Not because they doubted the conclusion, because they wanted to understand how it remained unsolved for so long. The answer was complicated. The case was not lost because there was no evidence. There was evidence everywhere. The problem was that the evidence existed in separate pieces. A note here, a photograph there, a witness statement ignored decades earlier, a forgotten recording stored in a box, a report that was never properly reviewed. For years, Those pieces sat alone, disconnected, silent, waiting. The breakthrough happened when investigators stopped asking one question: who did this? And started asking another: how was the truth hidden? That change in perspective transformed the entire investigation, because Eleanor's disappearance was never only about the person responsible. It was about the system that allowed the truth to disappear. The people involved understood something investigators did not. They understood that confusion was protection. They did not need to destroy every piece of evidence. They only needed to make the evidence difficult to understand. They created distractions. They encouraged false theories. They pushed attention towards strangers. They allowed the community to believe the answer was somewhere outside, when the answer had always been close. Very close. The final psychological analysis of the case described conspiracy as a chain. No single person carried the entire weight. Each person held one link. One person provided information. One person removed evidence. One person spread a false story. One person stayed silent. And together, those choices created decades of darkness. But chains can break. Sometimes all it takes is one person deciding to speak. In the Briggs case, that person was not a detective, not a government official, not a family member. It was a forgotten witness. A former employee who carried a memory for nearly 40 years. Daniel Voss, the man who finally revealed seeing the government vehicle near Rourke's logging camp. For decades, he believed speaking would destroy his life. He feared retaliation. He feared nobody would believe him. He feared the people involved were too powerful. But when he finally stepped forward, he gave investigators something more valuable than evidence. He gave them direction. He showed them where to look. And sometimes in a cold case, that is the difference between failure and discovery. After the case became public, Voss received hundreds of messages from people who thanked him for coming forward. But he always said the same thing: I waited too long. Investigators disagreed. They told him that without his statement, the case might never have been completed. Because even after decades, one honest decision could change everything. The story of Eleanor Briggs eventually reached people far beyond Maine. It became the subject of crime investigations, documentaries, and discussions about unresolved cases. But those closest to Eleanor resisted turning her into a legend. They wanted people to remember she was human. She had favorite songs, favorite books, favorite places. She laughed loudly. She hated being late. She wrote notes in the margins of everything she read. She loved teaching. She loved helping people. The mystery was only one chapter of her life, not the whole story. That was the final lesson investigators took from the case. Behind every cold case headline is a person whose life existed before the tragedy. A person with dreams, relationships, memories. A person who was more than what happened to them. The phrase that appeared in newspapers for years was, May 1981 cold case cracked. But for Eleanor's family, that headline was incomplete. The real story was not that a cold case was solved. The real story was that a woman who had been silent for decades finally had her voice returned. The evidence spoke. The witnesses spoke. The record spoke. And eventually, Eleanor spoke again. Through everything she left behind. Her notes, her journals, her courage, her warning. The final investigation archive closed with thousands of pages preserved forever. At the front of the file was a photograph of Eleanor standing outside her classroom, smiling, alive, before the disappearance, before the headlines, before the mystery. A reminder that every case begins with a person, and every person deserves to be remembered. The clocks in Eleanor Briggs's farmhouse stopped at 9:17. For decades, that moment represented the beginning of a nightmare. But in the end, it represented something else. A moment frozen in time. A moment waiting for the truth to catch up. And when it finally did, the silence that had covered Maine for 38 years was broken forever. The Briggs case was officially closed. But some stories do not end when the investigation ends. Some stories continue because the questions they raise remain powerful long after the evidence has been cataloged and the files have been archived. The disappearance of Eleanor Briggs became one of those stories. Not because it involved the most shocking crime, not because it involved the largest investigation, but because it revealed something far more unsettling. The truth had not been hidden in some distant place. It had been hidden in ordinary moments, in conversations, in decisions, in the small choices people made every day after Eleanor disappeared. The investigation showed that the greatest mystery was never simply where Eleanor had gone. The greatest mystery was how so many people had allowed themselves to believe a lie. For years, the community wanted an easy answer. They wanted to believe that danger came from somewhere else, from a stranger, from someone passing through, from someone who did not belong. But the truth forced them to confront something much harder. The danger had come from inside, from people who knew the town, people who understood its trust, people who knew that familiar faces were rarely questioned. That lesson became the most lasting part of the Briggs case, because crimes are often remembered for the person who commits them, but sometimes the people who protect the crime are just as important. Silence has consequences. And in Eleanor's case, silence became its own kind of prison, a prison that lasted for decades. After the investigation ended, several retired officers spoke publicly about the mistakes made in 1981. They admitted that investigators had been influenced by assumptions. They admitted that certain witnesses were trusted too quickly. They admitted that some evidence should have been examined differently. But they also said something else. They said every cold case contains a moment when the truth could have been discovered, a moment when one question could have changed everything. For Eleanor Briggs, that moment existed in the first few days. The missing report, the second set of footprints, the unusual phone calls, the suspicious vehicle, the witnesses who felt something was wrong. The clues were there, but they were scattered. And without the right perspective, scattered clues look meaningless. That was the tragedy of the investigation. Not that there were no answers, but that the answers were buried beneath years of misunderstanding. The final forensic review also revealed details about Eleanor's final hours that investigators had never known. Her actions showed preparation. She had not been caught completely unaware. She had attempted to protect herself. She had copied documents. She had hidden information. She had left behind warnings. She understood that someone might try to silence her, but she believed the truth would eventually matter. That belief became the reason investigators refused to let the case disappear again. One detective assigned to the final investigation later said that while reviewing Eleanor's journals, he felt like he was having a conversation with someone who had been waiting decades for someone to listen. Every page contained another piece of her personality, her frustration, her determination, her fear, her hope. She was not simply documenting evidence. She was documenting a fight against people who believed power could erase consequences. And in the end, they were wrong. The investigation also brought attention to the families of cold case victims. People often think the hardest moment is the discovery, the moment when the mystery ends. But families describe something different. They describe the years before, the birthdays, the holidays, the unanswered phone calls, the empty rooms, the endless possibility that maybe tomorrow will bring news. For Eleanor's family, those years were filled with questions. Every stranger could have been Eleanor. Every unexpected phone call could have been the answer. Every knock at the door carried a moment of hope. Until it didn't. The truth ended the waiting. But it also ended the possibility. That was the complicated reality of solving a cold case. Justice and pain often arrived together. The memorial created for Eleanor became a place where families from other cold cases also visited. People who understood the unique pain of waiting. People who knew what it meant to have someone disappear and leave behind only questions. They left flowers, letters, photographs, messages to people they never met. Because Eleanor's story became part of something larger. A reminder that every unresolved case represents someone still waiting. The phrase cold case often makes a crime sound distant, frozen, almost disconnected from real life. But the Briggs investigation proved the opposite. Cold cases are not frozen because people stop caring. They are frozen because the truth has not yet been found. And sometimes the truth is still moving, still waiting, still trying to reach the surface. Years after the case ended, a final package arrived at the sheriff's office. No return address, no sender. Inside was an old newspaper clipping from 1981. The headline showed Eleanor's disappearance. Written across the paper in faded ink were 6 words. They were looking in the wrong place. Investigators examined the package. They found no useful fingerprints, no DNA, no clear explanation of who sent it. The sender was never identified. Some believed it was simply another person connected to past, someone who wanted to acknowledge the truth. Others believed it was a final reminder, a message from someone who had watched the investigation unfold for decades. Either way, the meaning was clear. The truth had always been closer than anyone imagined. The Briggs case remained a warning about the dangers of protecting reputation over justice, about the cost of silence, about the damage caused when people choose comfort instead of truth. And above everything else, it remained a story about Eleanor, a woman whose voice was nearly erased, but not completely, because every note she wrote, every document she saved, every question she asked, survived. The people who tried to bury the truth had one advantage: time. But Eleanor had something stronger: evidence. And evidence has a way of waiting. The forests around Millinocket continue to grow. The roads continue to change. New buildings replace old ones. New generations move in. Life continues. But beneath the surface remains a memory of one woman whose disappearance became a decades-long search for justice. A woman who vanished in 1981. A woman whose case became a cold case. A woman whose truth waited patiently until the day the ground opened, until the evidence returned, until the silence finally ended. The Briggs case became more than a solved mystery. It became a scar on the history of northern Maine, a reminder that the most difficult investigations are not always the ones with the least evidence. Sometimes they're the ones where the truth is buried beneath too many lies. For decades, the community lived beside a question they could never answer. What happened to Eleanor Briggs? The question followed them everywhere, through changing seasons, through new generations, through years when the original investigators retired and the people who remembered the case grew older. The town changed. Businesses closed. New families arrived. Children who were not even born in 1981 grew up hearing whispers about the teacher who disappeared. They heard stories from their parents. Stories passed from one generation to another. Some details became exaggerated. Some became forgotten. But one thing remained constant. Everyone remembered Eleanor. That was something the people responsible never understood. They believed hiding the evidence meant controlling the story. They believed removing the truth meant erasing the person. But they were wrong, because Eleanor continued to exist in the memories of everyone who refused to forget. Her students remember her voice. Her family remembered her kindness. Her community remembered her determination. The people who tried to bury the evidence only created a mystery that kept her name alive. And eventually, that mystery brought the truth back. After the investigation concluded, authorities released thousands of pages of documents connected to the case. Researchers studied the files. Journalists examined the timeline. Future investigators analyzed the mistakes. And one pattern became clear. The Briggs case was not lost because investigators lacked dedication. Many officers worked tirelessly. Many volunteers searched through dangerous conditions. Many people genuinely wanted answers. The failure came from something more subtle: manipulation. The investigation had been influenced from within. Every time investigators moved closer to truth, someone redirected them. Every time evidence pointed toward the right people, another explanation appeared. A new theory, a new distraction, a new reason to look somewhere else. The people hiding the truth understood something investigators did not. The best place to hide a secret is sometimes inside an overwhelming amount of information. Too many details, too many possibilities, too many voices. The truth disappears when nobody knows where to look. But decades later, technology changed the rules. The old evidence became new evidence. The The forgotten clues became important clues. The things once considered useless became the foundation of the investigation. The scarf, the cassette tape, the photographs, the handwritten notes, objects that had waited silently for years. Each one carried a piece of Eleanor's final story. One investigator described the evidence as a message sent through time. A message that said, "I was here. This happened. Do not let them erase me." The final reconstruction of October 17th, 1981, remained one of the most disturbing parts of the investigation because it revealed that Eleanor had spent her final moments surrounded by people she knew, people she trusted, people she believed might help her. That detail affected investigators deeply. The greatest betrayal was not only what happened, it was who was involved. The people closest to the truth were the people who prevented it from being found. That realization changed the way many people viewed the case. It was no longer simply a murder investigation. It was a story about trust, and how easily trust can be weaponized. The final court documents describe the actions of those involved in careful legal language: evidence concealment, obstruction, participation in a criminal conspiracy. But behind those words were human decisions, moments when people could have chosen differently, moments when someone could have spoken, moments when someone could have stopped what was happening. But they did not. That became the darkest part of the Briggs story. Not only that people committed a crime, but that many opportunities existed to prevent it, and every opportunity was ignored. Years later, a young detective visiting the memorial site wrote a personal note in the investigation archive. It was not part of the official report. It was simply a reflection. This case was solved because people finally listened to the evidence instead of the story they had been told. That sentence represented everything about the investigation. For years, the community had been given a story about a woman who disappeared, a story about uncertainty, a story about missing answers. But the evidence told another story, a story about someone who fought to reveal the truth, a story about people who fought to hide it, and a story about time eventually exposing what they tried to protect. The final memorial ceremony for Eleanor was small. There were no politicians, no cameras, no dramatic speeches, only the people who wanted to remember her. A former student placed a notebook beside the memorial, a simple notebook, like the ones Eleanor used when she taught. Inside were messages from people who never met her, people who heard her story, people who wanted her to know that she was remembered. One message read, "You were not forgotten. You were waiting for us to find you." That sentence captured the strange reality of the Briggs case. For 38 years, it appeared Eleanor had disappeared. But in the end, she had been leading investigators toward the truth the entire time, through the evidence she preserved, through the warnings she left behind, through the questions she refused to stop asking. The final image associated with the case was not the farmhouse, not the burial site, not the suspects. It was Eleanor standing outside her classroom, smiling, a reminder that before the mystery, before the investigation, before the headlines, there was simply a woman living her life, a woman who deserved more than becoming a cold case, a woman who deserved to be remembered. And that was a final lesson left behind by the May 1981 cold case. Secrets can be hidden, evidence can be buried, truth can be delayed, but none of those things last forever, because eventually someone opens the old file, someone asks the forgotten question, someone looks at the evidence one more time, and when they do, the past answers.